So, hello and welcome back to this Doubtful Idealistic Crusade. Once again, I am here with another commentary for the official James Bond films. This time, talking about the official 14th film in the Eon series, which is 1985's A View to a Kill, starring Roger Moore, and the third of the five John Glenn directed Bond films of the 1980s. A View to a Kill is one of the films that has long been derided and considered a black sheep of the franchise, and is always one of those films certain fans, especially myself, feel the need to defend because it is usually grouped in along with The Man with the Golden Gun and Moonraker, and now Die Another Day usually as well, as being films that don't quite meet the series formula standards and is seen as a disappointment when in actuality those claims do these individual films a great disservice. But A View to a Kill in particular doesn't get usually the same level of defense as some of the other films, and it's almost always written off as being the film where it's just kind of by the numbers, and Roger Moore was too old to play the part, and it feels dated, or the plot is too similar to Goldfinger, and they just leave it at that, which is extremely unfair. Because in very many ways that I hope to cover in this track, I feel on repeat viewings, A View to a Kill is one of the most rewarding films in the franchise, in that it really reveals itself more and shows its much darker tonality. I feel A View to a Kill is really the bridging gap, the film that bridges the first two films of the 1980s that star Roger Moore, For Your Eyes Only and Octopussy. I feel it combines elements of both of those films and adds a darker tonality, which gives greater danger to Bond throughout the story. And really, A View to a Kill is thus the film that bridges that gap between For Your Eyes Only and Octopussy and the what would come to be known as the Timothy Dalton era of the next two films. So really, it's not just that A View to a Kill is the film between Octopussy and The Living Daylights, but thematically and especially tonally, I feel it is the film that really bridges the feeling between the two films. Because without A View to a Kill, it would be quite a jump going from Octopussy into The Living Daylights, and you can really sense this emerging darker tonality through the course of the film, which Roger Moore himself felt was a bit too violent and not exactly what, quote unquote, his Bond would be up to. But as something I feel was very necessary in order to keep the films grounded. And of course, the series was having to compete with increasingly graphic and violent competition at the box office, because at this point in 1985 you had far more competitors out there that had gone far further in the action and violence fields, particularly films like Rambo: First Blood Part 2, which was also released in 1985. So that was partially a conscious decision on the producer's part to maintain a darker feeling, but that had already been present, on For Your Eyes Only, with the intention of going back to Fleming's source material, bringing Bond back down to earth post Moonraker. And Octopussy had some of that, but had more of a grand adventure feel with a heavy dose of globetrotting. So A View to a Kill, it sort of blends elements of both of those films, but again, it reinforces this darker tonality, especially in the primary villain of the film, Max Zorin, as played by Christopher Walken. So it's a very interesting mixture of these factors. And again, I feel A View to a Kill really is that bridging film. So you can see they're starting to play around with some different ideas. They will polish and further in The Living Daylights, and they still have elements of For Your Eyes Only and Octopussy. And I think the key factor and what makes A View to a Kill maybe not always 100% successful in most people's minds is it is a transitional film of sorts. It is Roger Moore's seventh and final film. It's the final film for a number of the key cast and crew members, and that almost make maybe a sort of changing of the guard moment, if you would. Of course, this would happen, after the film's release. But with The Living Daylights, you did have a number of new key cast and crew personnel come in, and there was a new energy that was brought in, which happens every time the lead actor playing Bond changes out. It's not just that it's a new actor. There is some fresh blood that is injected, but they're already playing around with some new ideas. And what they do, interestingly, with the plotting and with addressing Roger Moore's age, is they don't make it an obvious thing. They make it intrinsic to the story, and it's in Roger Moore's performance. John Barry picks up on it in the score, and they never make a thing out of Bond's age, but it is expressly there in action and subtext, which honestly was a very brilliant move instead of playing it much more for obvious comedy, which you see in Sean Connery's performance in Never Say Never Again in 1983, where they played Bond being older for laughs, and they made it much more obvious, which is, a perfectly valid approach if you want to do it that way. But A View to a Kill is a very serious film, a very dark film. In fact, I think far darker than its immediate two predecessors by a large margin, which again is off-putting for some, and even Roger Moore thought they went a little bit too far. But I feel it is a more sedate film. And ironically, in a lot of ways, I always try to put my finger on what was this, how to describe this quality I enjoyed so much about the film, even when it was always being derided, because I've loved it ever since I saw this film. A bit of personal history: A View to a Kill was actually the second James Bond film I saw in its entirety after seeing Live and Let Die. So my first two experiences were with Roger Moore Bond films, but at the start and end of his tenure. So I didn't even notice the age difference at first. I just knew it was another James Bond adventure. And that's what Cubby Broccoli always maintained, that people came back because they wanted, not exactly, they wanted just more of the same. And yes, there is a James Bond film formula, and there is a degree of wanting the tried and true, and Bond had become an establishment by this point. But how to deliver the goods and how to repackage things while keeping certain core elements the same became the eternal challenge of the series. And what A View to a Kill does to make that a bit different, it's once again more sedately paced, but it allows Bond as a character to follow the trail of the mystery. It plays much more like a novel instead of a typical Bond film, which I think is really interesting. And it does seem to, it's not just because it's the 1980s, but being the giant Bond nerd that I am, I've always felt it was a little bit odd that the official films never really adapted parts of any of the continuation novels after saying they'd run out of Fleming materials. And if you look at A View to a Kill, not only because it's in the 1980s and this is an older Bond, it definitely is reminiscent of a number of especially the early John Gardner penned James Bond continuation novels that started in 1981 with License Renewed. Ironically, the same year Bond sort of relaunched as this more grounded older Bond in For Your Eyes Only. And some fans have even made further connections that there are some direct moments in A View to Kill that seem almost directly inspired by certain scenes or elements of some of the early John Gardner penned Bond novels. And I'll try and highlight some of those as we go along, because it is kind of interesting to look at some of those. And the official films have never, officially adapted or, credited they used anything really until the latest film, Spectre, used the ending torture sequence from the first continuation book, Colonel Sun, which was written all the way back in 1968 by Kingsley Amis. But if you look at View to a Kill very, very critically, and you can see Roger as an older character. He's a wiser person, a wiser agent. He's relying on his wits, but he can't quite do all the action anymore, and he's being confronted with this completely unreachable, psychotic villain. And there's this edge of desperation throughout the entire film, and it's really keyed up and highlighted by John Barry's scoring, which has that same desperate quality to it. You can see Roger in his performance getting actually worried and actually feeling as if James Bond is in danger again, but to a much greater degree than I think really we had gotten in a while. We'd gotten it in moments like the manhunt in Octopussy and other moments, but not consistently, and not at this consistent level throughout. And again, I think that's something that would follow through on in the Timothy Dalton era. So I feel these three films, For Your Eyes Only, Octopussy, A View to a Kill, in their own different ways are all sort of attempts along some different ideas to try and get to what we eventually got with the Timothy Dalton era of fully rebirthing a fully Flemingized Bond on screen, if you could use that as a term. And I feel A View to a Kill sort of marries together elements of For Your Eyes Only and Octopussy. And also, I'm going to try and make the argument, I think there's one or two things they pulled out of Fleming story materials that hadn't quite exactly been adapted. It is, obviously the title comes from a Fleming short story, but this is a case where they really just took the story title and obviously did not adapt the story, which really doesn't leave itself to be adapted for a feature film. But I really do think it marries ideas from the previous two films with this darker tonality, and it's a very rich film. It's a very rewarding film if you go with it and you allow its charms to wash over you, so you can enjoy this sort of more leisurely paced film that shows Bond as an older intelligence man, but still able to take care of the job in hand at the time. But also, it's very revealing of his character in moments, and we get things that we really don't get in other films in the series. Particularly scenes a lot of fans like to comment about, especially the scene where once Bond rescues Stacey Sutton from the goons in her house, he cooks her dinner and then tucks her in bed after she falls asleep. There's some somber moments. There's some really nice bits of character introspection, and I think Roger's performance is absolutely fantastic. I think it's one of his best performances as Bond, and I think he really matches what Christopher Walken brings to Zorin, and their scenes really do have a nice bit of each actor really playing off of each other's performance and adding strength to their own performance. And a lot of people have bemoaned the fact Timothy Dalton did not star in A View to a Kill, and what it would have been like had Christopher Walken Zorin gone up against the Timothy Dalton Bond. But I don't know if it would have had the same exact impact. It would have been different, of course, but I really do appreciate that. Although Octopussy really was a film that was designed to easily be a send-off for Roger Moore in the role, I really do appreciate we got this one final go-round, because it is a bit lower key in terms of story and scale, and a lot of people accuse it of being a bit too plain because it's primarily just in San Francisco and it doesn't feel like the stakes are super large. And again, everybody likes to talk about Zorin's plot being basically Goldfinger's plot, but 80s-ized, about microchips instead of gold. But all that aside, it's a very rewarding experience, because I think, again, you get so much about Bond's character, and I just adore the darker tonality that is interwoven into the film's plot line. And it's just a film that feels impressive, even if everybody wants to nitpick it to death. Which I, again, think is unfair, because I think the overall impact is so strong and so rewarding. And we do get things that we don't really see in some of the other Bond films. And the villains themselves are exceptionally strong, as is John Barry's fantastic score. So this will be one of my commentaries, like the ones I did for Moonraker and Golden Gun, that it definitely is a bit on the defensive side, because I feel this is a film that doesn't really get the proper respect it deserves. I think most people don't really give it a fair chance. So I encourage those fans out there who are not really into this film, if you do stick with me through this whole commentary, hopefully, I can maybe broaden your horizons a bit on the film, or maybe you give it a second chance after all this time, because it's definitely a film that grows on you. I think there is a lot of great subtext in there, and again, it's a film that I've found so rewarding over the years. And it's just, again, it may be just that darker tone I adore so much, and because it is really the bridging gap between the end of the Roger Moore era and the beginning of the Timothy Dalton era. And I think without this film, they wouldn't have been able to get that grittiness that we love so much about the Timothy Dalton films. This A View to a Kill is a film that was really necessary in terms of going from the ending of Octopussy and the beginning of The Living Daylights. So, with all that out of the way, that is my pre-ramble, as I like to call it, for all of these commentary tracks. Just want to do a quick preface on this, as I usually do. This is not a professionally recorded commentary, nor is it meant to be a definitive film production history, as it is, it would be practically impossible to get everything into a single commentary track, because I also try to do these with running commentary about scene-specific analysis and character analysis and overall plot line, along with production anecdotes and anything that pops through my head as any given scene plays as I'm commenting on it. And so basically, as Roger Moore always said in his commentaries, just look at this as if it were a friendly conversation, a bit, definitely a trifle one-sided in terms of conversations. But these are just general thoughts and some of the many millions of things that go through my head every time I rewatch any of the James Bond films. So again, this is not professionally recorded, and we will do a brief count-in to get us all synced up to a version of the film if you want to watch along with the commentary. I will go ahead and take a second to mention, even though the sound mixes really aren't all that different. This film was, released in Dolby Stereo, which got upmixed to 5.1 on disc. But if you do have the option, I always do recommend to go to the audio options and switch over to the original audio, which is listed as Dolby Surround. This film has a really nice Dolby Stereo mix for the mid-1980s. And again, as with the previous two films and the Timothy Dalton era films, I would argue something really kind of got lost in the upmixing process. And this film in particular has a really nice low end to the sound, and it's a bit there on the 2.0 surround original track that's on DVD and Blu-ray here in the U.S., but it really doesn't sound anywhere near as good as what you get on the Laserdisc release, which it seems pretty much untouched. So this is a film that I actually do swear up and down the Laserdisc does sound dramatically better. It just has so much more of an active low end. It feels much better even in a home theater environment, and even though it's not a discrete 5.1 rendering, I really do prefer it. So if you do have the Laserdisc of this film, the Letterboxd USA release, I highly recommend it. I think it's got the best sounding audio presentation of the film on disc to date. But you do at least get the option to listen to the original 2.0 Matrix stereo mix on the Ultimate Edition DVD and the US Blu-ray release. So without further ado, go ahead and queue up whichever version of the film you're going to be looking at. And since I usually say just skip past the opening logos and queue it up at the black area before the gun barrel starts. But of course, A View to a Kill starts with the Zorin disclaimer. So if you would, go to whichever version of the film and just queue it up before that appears, because that disclaimer is on all versions. So that way we can hopefully get the timing about right. So whichever version you're looking at, scrub past the MGM opening lion logo and cue it up to right before you see the white text of the Zorin disclaimer pop up. And then we will use that as our sync point and do a brief count-in and be off to the races, as it were. So now that everybody's queued up, we'll do just the usual brief count-in. So in 5, 4... 3, 2, 1, press play now. So, of course, the Zorin disclaimer was because the production found out there was an actual Zorin company, differently spelled, but they just wanted to cover their bases. So now we're in the gun barrel with John Barry's new gun barrel theme. Again, heavy usage of the triangle that he had switched to using throughout Octopussy every time the James Bond theme pops up. But it's a bit sprightlier, and we have the traditional second Roger Moore scope gun barrel, which opens onto the ice floes of Iceland. And the opening is a bit atmospheric for a pre-title sequence because, of course, we don't see Bond for a bit. We see all the opposing forces, and this is one of the rare times that Bond is actually behind Soviet lines, so we already know that he's in enemy territory. And again, we're not exactly sure what he's doing. We see the figure uncovering a dead body, which was later revealed to be the dead 003. And as soon as we see the helicopter go over, we hear John Barry's cue get really dramatic, and we see the first real reveal of Roger Moore's face, it's got a much darker quality to it than either of the openings of the previous two films. Because immediately as it starts, we're automatically in this darker feeling world. And this moment here is quite poignant because, of course, he pulls out the microchip, which is hidden inside the necklace where you see the images of family. And it's a little tiny poignant moment because, of course, this is a fallen comrade. But we see there's a hidden microchip. And then as soon as the guard cocks his rifle, that's when everything goes to hell and Bond has to get out of there. And John Barry's cue is bringing in what becomes the action theme of the film. But it already has this desperation to it, and that is really highlighted by the pulsating little bursts of what's really more of like a rock guitar that's just kind of poking through. And it adds this, it really reinforces the darker tonality that's going to come up in the rest of the film's story and plot line. But I just find it interesting that already in the pre-title sequence, we're seeing Bond really having to work for it. The skis have been blown up. He's going to have to commandeer a snowmobile, but he's really having to work for the escape, whereas we are used to something that is... The idea is more like the Goldfinger pre-title sequence where it's just a bit of fun. Well, this is fun, but it's got an air of desperation to it, which is going to be carried out throughout the rest of the film and the score. So, of course, the fun comes in how Bond is able to use the tools of his enemies against him, commandeer the snowmobile. And again, it's just striking how dramatic this is. Of course, we have to cut into set footage of Roger intermixed with the stuntmen and stuff, and everybody likes to complain that, Roger's not in the opening sequence too much, but, these are all pretty heavy stunts that most actors would not be allowed to do because of insurance. Now, this scene of making an improvised snowboard is often credited with being, a real impetus for making snowboarding more popular. Everybody loves to complain about the usage of the California Girls cover by Gidea Park here, but there's just something oddly, bizarrely charming about this that it just kind of grows on you. You can groan a little bit, but John Glenn did get John Barry to arrange this, so he did edit it a bit and cut around. It does remove the tension from the scene immediately, but we immediately go back into the John Barry music once this is over. But since this little bit is done for comedic effect and we have all the guards unable to keep up, it's very brief. It works. It's not really necessary, but it's just one of those little weird quirks that you come to really love and appreciate in some bizarre fashion. But it really doesn't fit in the dark tone they're coming up with. And then the first time we get the full shot of Roger's face, he definitely looks a bit flustered because he's obviously gone through all that, crazy ski chase. But it is a bit jarring because, of course, Roger looks quite a bit different in this film compared to Octopussy, and it's not his age. It is because in between films he did get some facial plastic surgery, which I think is the real key factor in why everybody says, oh, he looks so old. Well, he was older. He was 57 by the time the film did get released, but I think it is his facial features looking so different, and he no longer has his iconic facial mole, and some of the wrinkles are gone. He physically looks different, and it's kind of this strange disconnect, and that's because between films he did wind up getting some work done. That to me, I think, is the primary factor in why he looks so different, and why everybody immediately goes, "Oh, he looks so old." So I think that's kind of unfortunate. I don't think he needed it, but obviously he might have felt that at the time. But I think that's the key factor in why he looks so different between Octopussy and A View to a Kill. Now, I do love the idea of the iceberg camouflage for a submarine. Yes, it's a bit goofy, like the crocodile submersible in Octopussy, but it makes enough sense. It is a Bondian type idea. A lot of people like to analyze some of the smallest details about these films, but that's just something I've always thought was, cheeky and funny enough. And of course, there's a beautiful woman at the controls, played by Mary Stavin, who was one of Octopussy's girls in Octopussy, so she gets a second film. And then the great edit here, where we see the iceberg sub go off, and as soon as it crosses the other ice floe, hard cut into Maurice Bender's opening titles and the classic Duran Duran theme song, which is unbelievably effective. And I think this is one of Binder's most inspired titles in a while because every element is perfectly cut. The great bit here with the girl unzipping the jacket, revealing the 007 logo, and then going into her open jacket, as it were. It's just an inspired Maurice Bender title sequence. And I think he really latched on to the title song. He loved to cut his visuals to the beats and the feeling of the title song. But often he would have to do it without it and then, slap it together later to try and make it work. It's also one of the songs that isn't edited down, so that also helps that we get the full song. And the imagery is just really wonderfully done. Lots of nice color and a lot of darkness too, and then usage of fire as well, since of course the main refrain of the song is "Dance to the Fire." And as Binder liked to do, we get lots of shots of Roger's silhouette, which gives us the idea of Bond participating, and the main female face we see almost has the appearance of Grace Jones's Mayday. So I've always felt that Binder was maybe trying to definitely suggest the idea of the villainess to come. Of course, we see most of the same key cast and crew returning from the previous two films. One of the earlier shots of Roger, but then again, Binder really, I think, nailed the editing and cutting of this for the Duran title song. Of course, the song itself is also famous for being the Bond song that went to #1 on both US and UK charts, and I think really it was a perfect synthesis between the band and John Barry as arranger. Of course, the band was breaking up at the time, so it was a difficult process of recording the song, and Barry eventually got so frustrated he had to just really piece together the arrangement himself in a lot of ways. But it was definitely the most driving theme song for any film since... really since Live and Let Die. I don't think that's something up for debate. It's just definitely the first song in a more rock-type vein in a long while, and getting away from the ballads was a good idea to keep things fresh. But it's such a fantastic song. It's become one of the timeless Bond themes, and of course one of Duran Duran's immortal hits. In fact, it's so effective, it's often definitely puzzling why they've never been approached to do another theme song, because they still could at this time. But it was definitely great for the film's promotion that it was so successful, and they had this #1 hit song to use to market the film, which they really had not had on the previous two films, of course. I always like that we have some bit of business coming out of the titles. There's just the guards going across, but it's helpful to have something instead of just a straight cut. Now here Bond hangs up his hat, and this is the last time we see any allusion to the hat. We don't get the hat toss of Bond's hat, but he will toss Moneypenny's hat at the very end of this scene. Now, one little nitpick that's always bugged me, Roger's line reading there when he says Moneypenny, his voice kind of cracks a little bit, and I've always felt they should have redubbed that. That's the only minor quibble I have. And of course, here in the close-ups, you can definitely see that the work I was talking about earlier that Roger had between films. He looks a bit different, so that's the key factor. Up there's the hat toss. So the last time Bond tosses a hat, it's not his own, it's Moneypenny's hat. And of course, this would be the last time that we saw Lois Maxwell playing Miss Moneypenny. So A View to a Kill marked her 14th and final appearance in the official series, because of course they recast when the Timothy Dalton era began. I love the idea that Q always carries around his gadgets, so he's playing with the snooper device in M's office. Of course, it's also narrative saving, because this way we don't have to have a Q's lab scene later on to see him playing around with the snooper, and it's established already. And of course, Q gets to give us the typical Q technical speech that will lead us into our main plot line, because of course it's in M's office. So the idea of the film is that there is a special microchip being developed in very secure factories that is going to be hopefully resistant to electromagnetic pulse, which Bond explains very helpfully here because most people in 1985 would not be aware of that. And ironically, they would pull from this 10 years later an idea that's only mentioned but never used in this film, and that will become the basis for the GoldenEye device in GoldenEye 10 years later. But the idea of this being developed as for government purposes, and then the idea that it could be stolen by obviously by the Russians, and that there's some sort of inside leak in the plant where it is made. That's what gets us on to Zorin in the first place. This isn't an idea that often gets overlooked, but this is what starts the mystery, which is doled out very similar to what we had in Octopussy, being much more about Bond following clues on a mystery trail and the plot being doled out in sections. And Bond very cleverly immediately inquires about, well, what about checking Zorin himself if the security check was clear? And, Freddie Gray is immediately dismissive of this due to his, civil appearance. A point I would like to make, this whole setup and Bond going out to investigate something, it definitely has echoes, I think, of the opening third or so of the Moonraker novel, I would argue. So there are several bits of Fleming that I think sort of indirectly get referenced in the structure and plotting of A View to a Kill. And I think the whole idea of Bond investigating the possible, stealing and messing around with these microchips is very similar to how in the novel his original case is to investigate goings-on at Sir Hugo Drax's Moonraker rocket factory, because of course that's being developed for the British government, or so they think. This scene is one of the scenes that I think you could make the point that maybe they were inspired a bit by the John Gardner novels, because of course it's taking place at Ascot, and Bond encounters the villain of the film for the first time, which also happens in Gardner's first Bond novel, License Renewed. So it's never been officially stated as such, and Ian always indicated they sort of kept up with the various continuation novels through the years, but didn't really pay them much mind. But there's a couple instances in this film where it may be that they read some of those early novels and were influenced a little bit by them. Of course, this is our first glimpse again of Christopher Walken as Zorin and Grace Jones as Mayday, and it's nice that we get to see them in their civil guises, and we're introduced to the theme of horse racing, and that will, of course, lead to Zorin having several aces up his sleeve, and obviously being a complete cheat at this for reasons we don't know as of yet. But it's always very revealing of the Bond villain's character that he's compelled to do these things. And we see our first glimpse of Patrick Macnee as Sir Godfrey Tibbett, and just it's always amazing seeing him and Roger Moore on screen together. They were great friends in real life, but here in A View to a Kill, for classic spy fans, we get James Bond and John Steed on screen, and that in and of itself is just pure magic. But even here in this first scene, their chemistry together is just off the charts, and it makes the rest of their scenes together an absolute delight. But we're getting plot machinations here about this horse racing being very shady, and Tibbett has all these misgivings, and we get our first glimpse of Mayday in action as she has to calm down Pegasus, and the idea that maybe not just Pegasus but Mayday herself is on some sort of steroid enhancement. But the one bit of character I really do like here is, okay, we're going to investigate Zorin further, but Bond has purchased a ticket and bet on Pegasus winning. So not only is that showing that he knew that Zorin would almost likely win, and that Zorin is of some sort of, resonance, but he also gives the ticket to Moneypenny to cash because, as a gentleman, not only did he know Zorin would win, but he gives it to Moneypenny so she didn't lose her money, which is just a nice touch I've always enjoyed. Now, this scene with Aubergine here, it doesn't really add up to much. It's really here just as a setup to get to the chase on the Eiffel Tower, which is the iconic set piece of the Paris sequence. And Aubergine is, definitely kind of played more for laughs as a character, and the only real bit of information that he gives is that Zorin's going to have a horse sale, because, of course, he's cut off by the poison butterfly in just a moment. But this whole scene is nicely laid out. We get this sort of view of the higher life and the better living, and Bond is the gourmet, which is so important to not just the Bond novels, but any Bond film, and it's something that often gets shortchanged in the in the idea of keeping the narrative moving. And these moments are important, even though they're just transitional or they're like window dressing, because they help enhance the idea of higher living and the richer world and surroundings. And of course, it is ostensibly a restaurant in the Eiffel Tower. You're not going to go there every day. But it also gives Bond these little moments. He looks around at the show of the butterflies on these fishing rods and the beautiful woman whistling on stage, and he has all these strange looks. He's just taking all of this in, and it allows Roger to add these bits of characterization that make Bond feel much more three-dimensional. And there's so many more of these moments in View to a Kill than really the previous two films. And again, while this scene doesn't really do very much, it allows the chase to come up when Mayday kills Aubergine. And you would think, why wouldn't they just let him live? Because he really doesn't know anything other than there's going to be a horse sale. But he's obviously digging around and has found out too much. And Zorin has him killed regardless of the consequences, which is also, in analysis, another great moment of hubris that, the villain doesn't even care about somebody trying to connect the dots. He just has him killed anyway. And delivering those one-liners, there's a fly in his soup, is not an easy thing for any actor to do. So the fact that Roger can do that with the requisite weight and aplomb and then immediately just run out of the room is, again, it's not an easy thing to do. And it's a very simple thing. They're just running up the stairs, but it's on the Eiffel Tower, and they're actually there, which makes all the difference in the world. Because, of course, before this, and most of the time, people would be using process plates and wouldn't always have the actors literally at the Eiffel Tower. Of course, there are, stuntmen used throughout for both Roger and Grace Jones, but you obviously would have to do that at this location on these tricky stairs and things like that. And this is one of those moments everybody likes to complain that Roger looks too old. He's have to struggle to keep up. But again, this is an older Bond, and they don't try and hide it, which I do really appreciate. And they don't play it for laughs, and they don't make it obvious. But it is a quality that's there. And again, John Barry picks up on this desperation here in his score. We have the iconic moment where Mayday actually jumps off the Eiffel Tower, which was performed by B.J. Worth and his crew, returning for more aerial work. And it's just another really striking moment that's allowed to play out, and we get the tracking shot where we, with Bond, follow the parachute down. And for most people, that would be the end, because you could obviously follow a parachute, but this leads us into the lovely chase through Paris, where Bond will follow the parachute at any cost. I've always loved that moment where Bond literally jumps onto the elevator, and yes, obviously it is a stuntman in the long shot. I think the only thing with the stuntman is, and you will see it here in this car chase once the roof gets cut off, there are one or two moments in the editing where they hold the shots just a little bit too long, and that makes the usage of stuntman just a little obvious in a few places. Other than that, it's relatively well camouflaged, but that's just a point that everybody likes to make, that, oh, you can see stuntmen everywhere, and Roger Moore was old, but there would always be stuntmen used. Now, the fun of the sequence, of course, comes where Bond has commandeered this little Renault, and it gets destroyed bit by bit, and Bond goes around breaking most of the Napoleonic Code. That was the shot there where you see the stuntman's head once the roof gets cut off for that split second. But I would make the argument that that shot had to be held to actually show that there was still somebody inside the car. And then enough cutaways to following the parachute, and that causing Bond to be distracted. And it is unbelievably a humorous, funny gag of seeing, the car literally still going, being a front-wheel drive car, but that being all that is left of it. So it's well done. It's over very quickly, and it doesn't go on for too long like we saw in the Thames chase in The World's Not Enough later on. But again, there is this desperate quality to this action sequence, even though John Barry brings in the James Bond theme and it's got the heavy triangle usage, so it's suggested of a bit of fun like we got in the Tuk Tuk Chase and Octopussy. But again, I would make the argument here the chase is a lot tighter narratively and it's edited more tightly. Bond fails to capture Mayday. He doesn't even know who she is, so the unknown assailant got away. But in a really nice reveal, now we see Mayday and Zorin revealed in their true guise. Zorin has come out and piloted the boat himself, and they enjoy the fact that they've just killed this man. Now, originally there was a deleted scene there where Bond is picked up and they give him all his items back, and he has various gadgets from previous films and some silly Q gadgets. It's a funny little scene, but it was wise they cut it because it feels like something much more out of a straight comedy or a Pink Panther film almost, and really doesn't. Because the gags in that sequence are so goofy, it doesn't really fit the much more somber tone and serious tone of the rest of the film. And again, Patrick Macnee, just with a slight smile, just immediately makes you crack a grin. And now we're into the sequence at Chantilly, with this gorgeous location for Zorin's estate and horse sale. And of course, Bond is undercover as St. John Smythe, which we actually don't see Bond doing all that often, actually adopting a cover and playing it to the hilt. So it's another example of a refreshing use of actual spycraft and intelligence work that was really something that they had interjected into the series again, and For Your Eyes Only, as a definite nod to try and make the films more realistic and grounded again, actually having Bond do spying things and elements of spycraft. So anytime I see those, it immediately makes me happy because it feels more grounded, and it makes Bond actually, look like he's doing actual spy work, which he is. Again, A View to a Kill, the plot is carefully doled out in little doses and kept mysterious, as we had seen in Octopussy before. So it's, once again, I like to make the point that this film is really sort of blending ideas from the previous two films, trying out some new things, and really going for a darker feel throughout. It's even here in the scene where Patrick Bouchot as Scarpine, who is Zorin's right hand, and has such a looming quality in all his scenes, even though he doesn't have the most dialogue. He's just showing this guy around the horse sale, but there's an ominous quality. As soon as Bond and Tippett get to Zorin's estate, it's very ominous. And again, this whole film has a darker tonality throughout. I must point out there, that, of course, that the Rolls-Royce that they're driving around in was actually Cubby Broccoli's personal Rolls-Royce, with the license plate Cub 1, which I always thought very endearing that they needed a car, so they just used the producer's own car. And once again, I just can never get over the idea that, it's just Bond and Steed running around, even if it is in a seemingly mundane locale, a horse stables, but the idea that Roger Moore and Patrick Macnee are on screen together and it's a Bond film, you can't help, as a spy nerd, making that association and immediately, being as giddy as a 5-year-old about it. And I think John Barry really, with his score, gets to this darker tonality, the heart of the film that I'm going on about, just so perfectly. And in fact, his score is really the darkest score, the most dramatic score I think we had gotten in a long while. Really, I think it's the most dramatic and dark, and because of this desperate quality, I think it really it harkens back most to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and in fact it really references, Barry references his own works. He references OHMSS and some of those themes. You hear it in the earlier cue for the pre-title sequence, but it has that sort of feeling, and so he uses his symphonic style he had developed. It builds on his Octopussy score, but it's far more dramatic. I think it's actually, I think it is a better score than his Octopussy score. It's more engaging, and again, like I think the film and the plotline of the darker story sets up what we see in The Living Daylights, I feel John Barry is already setting the stage for where he's going to go further musically with The Living Daylights, which would be his final Bond film score. This is Alison Doody as the wonderfully named Jenny Flex, which is one of my all-time favorite double entendre names in the entire series. And, of course, another Indiana Jones connection because, of course, she would turn up in The Last Crusade 4 years later. Now, this is the wonderful bit of comedy where we have Bond and Tippett playing their roles and Bond really enjoying making Tippett the beleaguered manservant. And it's just... It's not overdone at all, but it's wonderfully played. It's, obviously out of a classical, much more of a screwball comedy type routine. But it is an excellent idea for cover, and it gives us a nice glimpse into the main chambers of Zorin's estate, and we get that nice moment where Mayday is just glaring menacingly and then disappears. She has this sort of angel, or I shouldn't say angel, but this death-like prominence throughout. Every time she appears, she is like the literal figure of death and suggests, evil tidings to come, and of course has very little to no dialogue, so that is very much in keeping with the classical striking Bond henchman. It goes right back to Oddjob and Red Grant. Then they get to continue the bit here, and we actually see them using spycraft. They're searching for listening devices, and then they have the specially prepared tape, which I just find hysterical. I wish it were possible to listen to the entire tape, because as the security man says, I'd hate to be St. John Smythe's valet, and all the bits about, oh my lord, Tippett, what the devil's wrong with these shoes? I'm sorry, sir. It's absolutely priceless, and the idea that Roger Moore and Patrick Macnee stood around and recorded some and wild tracked some of these lines to make this little dummy tape is just so endearing. And again, I wish it were possible to listen to the whole thing because it's such a funny idea and it's so well performed and is exactly what, a spy would have to do. And then, of course, they go outside to have a conversation, and then Bond gets to play around it a little bit. Successful cover becomes almost second nature. And this is where, of course, Tippett is able to talk about Pegasus disappearing from the stable, which obviously they talked a little bit about in the car ride over, but that being the only place where they weren't observed. This allows Bond to see the helicopter arriving, which obviously is bringing someone of some importance. So when Stacey Sutton gets out and is personally met by Zorin and Dr. Mortner, who Tippett saw, and so they know that he is a power player in Zorin's organization of some sort, we get this nice, almost romantic cue. So Bond is seeing Stacey for the first time, who is, of course, played by Tanya Roberts. It's definitely, obviously setting her up as someone of some importance. And we get a nice bit of byplay here about, Bond being expected to sacrifice himself. And obviously he has a reputation within the service. And we get this party scene with a complete historical setup with, all the waiters and extras perfectly costumed right down to having, sort of period accurate wigs and things. This is another scene that a lot of people like to poke around at and say isn't exactly necessary. But again, I think there's a lot of character. There are a number of things going on, but there is, very little dialogue. And what dialogue there is seemingly perfunctory and surface level. But it is Bond trying to gain more information about Zorin's organization, and he does so. He will eventually break into Zorin's office. We get this lovely exchange with Mayday. Again, no dialogue, but she is so wonderfully present in the scene, so menacing, and there's no dialogue, and we know that this will set up their eventual confrontation to come. And this is a gadget not explained before. One of the few times we see a Q-Branch gadget without the explanation in the lab. But the idea of it being a practical gadget, being able to use these sunglasses to cut out the glare of a window to observe things going on, seems much more a typical useful spy gadget, as will be the Ring camera in a moment. And, of course, the check copier we will see Bond use here, breaking into Zorin's office. So, again, using actual spycraft, and he's breaking and entering here inside the villain's lair, as it were. And we get to see him slip around out of the party via duplicitous means and hopefully unobserved break into Zorin's office to figure out exactly what he's doing. So there is some nice sleight of hand, and we will get some fun duplicitous dialogue in the end of this sequence where Bond is still fishing for information and trying to get and provoke not only reactions but also clean facial shots for his Ring camera. So there are several levels to this scene, several layers going on, and this will establish the attempted $5 million payoff that Zorin makes to Stacy. So again, this will give Bond some idea that Zorin is obviously wanting to buy her off for some unknown reason when they encounter each other again in San Francisco. And also it gives us a nice view of Zorin's office for the later scene, the great scene, where we get the Bond villain confrontation, but under the civil guise. And of course, Bond seemingly escapes unnoticed, but then, hey, Dr. Mortner shows up. So Roger's able to, with the slightest shrug of the shoulders, shake it off and try to make it as if it were nothing, and he is indeed this St. John Smythe who just inherited some horses. Of course, anytime you have someone in a role putting on airs, it becomes sort of a performance within a performance. And Bond, in the course of the film, actually takes, two different guises. So it's interesting to see how Roger modulates his performance in the St. John Smythe guise and later on in the James Stock guise. It's very minor, but it is there. And again, here you can see how Bond is trying to manipulate people into giving things away about themselves. So now he knows that not only Zorin has Connolly working for him, who is in the oil business, but now he has a facial shot, and he will do the same here to get a clear picture of Dr. Mortner. And of course, Mortner is one of the most interesting characters in the film, and his backstory about being the escaped Nazi war criminal scientist, and he had done experiments in the concentration camps, and that's what led to the production of the super genius of Zorin, who is also completely psychotic. It's an interesting backstory. It's absolutely fascinating, and the idea that he gets away and was, the Russians had holed him up somewhere for years so he could perform experiments for them. And Zorin started out as a KGB agent who eventually went rogue and solo for himself. It's an interesting idea, and it adds a dimension to Zorin as a character and his whole upper tier organization. Now, this is a wonderful example of the Bond and villain back and forth, where Bond will use dialogue tied into the plot to, provoke a reaction out of the villain. So, of course, here Bond pivots to sportsmanship and then actually does fly casting with the little hand gesture, but he doesn't get a reaction out of Zorin. He gets a blank stare, but you can see in Zorin's eyes, okay, now I know something is up with this guy. But Bond doesn't get the typical knee-jerk reaction, which is the first real indication that we have of Zorin being unreachable and being a bit off. And that, of course, is because he is a psychotic madman with a hyper-intelligence who is so removed from the rest of humanity that, he only considers himself and everything else is secondary. And he really does enjoy killing people. So the idea of human life means nothing to him. So it's already sowing some of those seeds that Zorin is definitely the first Bond villain that is completely off-kilter mentally in that sort of way. And because he already knows something is up with this St. John Smythe character now that he sees him interacting with Stacey Sutton, he knows that something is up and suggests to, keep a closer watch on him and split the pair of them up. And Tanya Roberts does have really striking blue eyes, which was one of the things that really drew the production to cast her after seeing her in the film The Beastmaster. And the idea that Mayday is the one that comes and breaks them up. And, the idea of Bond appearing in her bed later as a cover, this is the moment where that is, given precedence that, since Bond can't get back to his hotel room later, he uses that on the fly, on the spur of the moment, to use as a cover for why he wasn't in his room when they go to look for him after this sequence. So it's a nice unexpected payoff when that happens later, and Bond does it on the fly again. So it is Bond using his wits, which is always helpful. And that's another thing a lot of people don't make a distinction about here. You do see some gadgetry in A View to a Kill and Octopussy as well, but there is still a definite shying away from the traditional Bond Q gadgets that came up in For Your Eyes Only, which started with blowing up the Lotus in the beginning of the film. There are some gadgets here, but they are each used once and used for actual spycraft and are simplistic items that are never seen again. We don't have a traditional life-saving Q gadget anywhere, and this is another film, like the previous two films, that has Bond relying much more on his wits. Now, this is a nice bit of classic John Glenn misdirection. We see the hand come up, and we know most likely it is Bond, but it's a nice bit of drama that works better than the traditional John Glenn jump scare, usually with an animal, which, of course, we will have one of in this film as well. It wouldn't be a John Glenn Bond film without a pigeon coming out of somewhere or an animal coming out of somewhere to provide a jump scare. I've always loved this scene as well, and this is uncovering more of Zorin's plot to cheated horse racing. And again, that doesn't necessarily have very much or anything to do with the overall plot, but because they know Zorin is already doing this simply to cheated horse racing, they know the lengths he will go to. And when they get into the factory trying to get away from the guards, they obviously see that Zorin is, as Bond says, hoarding microchips. And that leads Bond later on, when more of the mystery is uncovered, to understand why he is hoarding and stockpiling microchips, because he knows he is going to personally provoke and cause a worldwide shortage of microchips by destroying Silicon Valley. So you may not make that connection on the first watch, but it is amazing to see a film's plot line make direct callbacks to itself in that sense, and even after that long of a gap, and to play out at a definite pace to, again, not treat the audience as if they're stupid, actually engage the audience. And it's interesting to see how the co-writing, screenwriting team of Richard Maybaum and Michael G. Wilson here, again, as they did in Octopussy, use the plot and dole it out in bursts, again, much more like a traditional mystery. So Bond becomes a detective figure of sorts and has to piece this stuff together along with the audience. Because here, of course, Bond and Tippett only have a small piece of the puzzle, as it were. So it's sort of pulling that from Octopussy again, and I'd like to make the distinction: A View to a Kill is really bringing together ideas from both Octopussy and For Your Eyes Only. And then something as minor as putting the tube in the wrong slot is what gives them away, which is a nice touch. And also, Tippett is not an experienced agent. He is a MI6 man, but he is more of a specialist. So it's interesting and endearing for his character that, we have Bond going around with someone who is not at Bond's own level of experience, instead of something where he was running around with the CIA agent or Felix Leiter or something. It's interesting, and it helps these scenes have a little bit of extra drama because, of course, Tippett makes a mistake, and that gives Bond away later, which causes Zorin to check him further and reveal his identity and blow his cover. Which, of course, wasn't helped here by the fact that they fight the two goons and put them on the assembly line. And the idea of Tippett not being experienced is furthered here by, him not faring well at all in this fight and getting, beat up a bit. And I must admit, the gag of the guys being thrown in the boxes and put on the assembly line and tied up, it's a funny gag. It's simple, but it works in some strange way. And I love the sort of gallows humor of Bond putting the second guy on and not inside a box and just having him tied up, and then the strap going over his eyes. But of course, this should be pretty obvious when they get further down the line a little bit later, and of course we see the just literal body going along the assembly line. And then we immediately go to this really striking scene, which, at first seems as if it is just Zoran and Mayday having their own, private kickboxing gymnasium, but it becomes a rather sort of twisted love scene in a way, which establishes them as having a romantic relationship of sorts. And the way the actors play this, Mayday is so visceral, and Zoran just laughs. First he's pinned down and he laughs, and then Mayday starts to literally snap at him, and the way he comes down on her once he's reversed positions, and then they finally get to kiss, which is broken by the ringing of the phone. But it's this sort of interesting, very dark, and very it definitely feels twisted in a way, and we don't know really anything about them, but it definitely does not feel normal at all. And you can see Mayday's frustration, which obviously has built over time. It's a relationship that obviously doesn't seem very two-sided. It definitely seems self-serving for Zoran in a way. And of course, this will be fulfilled by his eventual, just dumping of Mayday, literally to be killed in the main strike by him. Now, this is a nice bit of action here where Bond has to get back to the room before it's discovered that he's out, and the tape they left ran out, which is a technological limitation that adds drama, but I've always felt, couldn't they have just used a longer tape or a bigger tape machine? I guess, using a small portable tape recorder meant that they could only record like 45 minutes or something. Now this, as I mentioned before, this is a great bit of Bond using his wits. They're already in the room. And now Mayday realizes that, he was the man at the Eiffel Tower. We must find him. But some people complain about this. But of course, you have to remember Mayday was in a mask and only had a slit to view through because she was disguised as one of the butterfly-wielding people. And of course, was running for her life off the top of the Eiffel Tower. And Roger plays this wonderfully. And so does Christopher Walken, because obviously he's in a relationship with Mayday. We've just had this established. But then he stands there, he chuckles a little, and then he nods and walks off as his lover goes to sleep with another man who he knows is an enemy now of some sort. So it's interesting, and it shows once again that, Zoran really doesn't have the same level of feeling for Mayday. And of course, there is a slight jump there when Bond holds up the sheet because, of course, they cut around any potential nudity of Grace Jones getting in the bed. This on set with Grace Jones is one time, literally the only time anybody knows of, where Roger Moore didn't exactly get along with a co-star. It was said that Grace Jones was a bit difficult on the set, but they did work in, or she worked in, a great gag to play on Roger, who was known for being a great practical joker on sets. And during that scene when she disrobed, she had a gigantic dildo, as it were, which completely broke up the entire crew. So it's basically Roger getting a dose of his own medicine. Now, this scene I alluded to before, I absolutely adore this sequence. It is the Bond villain meeting in civil guise, but the villain sort of feeling out Bond and realizing who he is, of course, with a technological slant, where Zoran has facial recognition software and is able to get Bond's exact identity. And I presume with he seeing, as we find out later, he was a KGB agent originally, maybe he's tied into the KGB database somehow, and that's how he gets the information on 007. But in a nice reverse of the earlier scene with the Ring camera, Bond directed people's attention to get clear shots. Well, now Zoran does it to Bond because he will get him to give facial profile shots without realizing it. And Roger, as Bond, is still playing the St. John Smythe character, so he's sort of playing around. The dialogue is ultimately pointless. It's just about horses. But the way that Christopher Walken plays this scene, the little bits of amusement, the chuckles when he's looking ostensibly at horses, the menace he adds to lines about horses. Would you be more interested in stamina or speed? And then even the directness of how he presses the computer's keys, I think I have just the horse for you. And ultimately, this seems like a civil conversation. Zoran smiles and says, Scarpine will collect you. And if you look closely at this film, Scarpine is literally Zoran's right hand. He does everything. Scarpine will start us. Scarpine will collect you. And, of course, is why Scarpine is left alive at the end. Because, of course, what would Zoran do without Scarpine, who literally does everything for him? And on repeat viewings, you know what fate befalls Sir Godfrey, and Patrick Macnee is so absolutely lovable that you just immediately start to get the feelings of tension because you just don't want to see him go, and he is one of the most effective sacrificial lambs in the entire series because he is so likable, and Patrick Macnee was such a great actor that and his chemistry with Roger is so great that it's one of those moments on repeat viewings here when Mayday comes out and then disappears and Sir Godfrey drives off. It's like, no, don't do it, because you know what is to come. And it's really the one time in the series where you feel it the most on repeat viewings. I would say maybe Corinne's death and Moonraker as well, where she comes out and then walks back into the forest and everybody in the audience jumps up. No, don't do that. A very, very similar idea here. And it's also interesting to note how I made the connection with the earlier parts of the Moonraker novel earlier, but this sequence does also resemble the bits in the Moonraker film where Drax tries to kill Bond, but under civil guises where it could be, accidental. Where specifically the scene of the grouse hunting that sort of takes place here, but on horseback. And the music becomes more dramatic, and being intercut with Sir Godfrey being killed, this is where Zoran now is out and out trying to kill Bond, and it becomes obvious to Bond in the build-up to the horse steeplechase sequence, and becomes plain when everyone's out to kill him and the entire track is rigged. And of course, Bond doesn't know that Sir Godfrey is actually being murdered right now. But we, the audience, does, and that combined with John Barry's music becoming increasingly ominous just adds to the tension of this scene and the steeplechase sequence. This scene definitely makes you look behind you every time you get your car washed. Almost in a similar way you always peek through the shower curtain after seeing Psycho again. And that sort of hiding in the back of the car and strangling someone becomes almost the Mayday hallmark, or she has a penchant for doing that because, of course, she will do the same thing to Chuck Yip's character later on in the film. And here with the shots of the other jockeys, it automatically becomes clear to Bond, all these other rough guys, it's definitely not going to be a friendly race. And Zoran just throws out the challenge, and when Bond asks, what happens if I lose? And Zoran simply replies, then you lose. And that's it. Of course, the implication is, of course, death. And as always, Zoran is completely amused by Bond's every reaction. I always love the way that not only Scarpine, but all of Zoran's henchmen and the other jockeys in the sequence, they're all smiling because they apparently have done this before, and they love the idea of Zoran screwing with some guy they don't even know, or, ostensibly killing him. But it's also very revealing of the villain's ego that he's set all this stuff up to use at some time anyway to cheat at horse racing. But also that he's decided to kill Bond in this way, which ultimately fails, but in a method of sporting. So he would then ostensibly get a double win. He kills Bond, but he also beats him. So he doesn't just have to kill Bond. He has to beat him as well. He has to win in every conceivable way because, Bond ostensibly is going to win the horse race, but Zoran, activates the steroid via the microchip and the cane, which causes the horse to rear, run from the track. Thus, Bond loses the race. So it's, again, a very interesting character trait that Zoran does this. Not only does he have to win, when he realizes he won't win, that's when he causes Bond to lose anyway. And then that's what causes the horse to flee, and Bond has to navigate through the woods. And again, there, even in a small sequence like this, there's a desperation that just is really unique to A View to a Kill, and everything in here is plausible, but it's got this desperate quality. And then the reveal of Sir Godfrey being dead is that Bond gets to the rolls and jumps on and sees Mayday, but in Sir Godfrey's hat. And I've always loved the fact that Bond doesn't worry about being disarmed because he's clearly outnumbered, but he immediately checks Sir Godfrey and realizes that he is, of course, dead. And when Zoran uses 007, that's when you see Roger straighten up and drop the St. John Smythe voice, and then you get, the killing Sir Godfrey was a mistake. And Zoran is just completely nonplussed. And when Bond visibly gets angry, that's when we get, "You amuse me, Mr. Bond." It's amazing to see how Zoran is continually carrying on in his usual fashion, which works with everyone else. But when Bond fights back and uses his, superior experience, Zoran becomes amused by this, almost as if he knows he's still going to beat Bond somehow because he's so much more brilliant than everyone else due to his brilliant IQ. But he is amused at Bond's, in Zoran's view, almost feeble attempts to compete with his own brilliance. So again, it's showing the villain's ego, and it's just really a multifaceted performance. And I love Christopher Walken in anything, but not just because I'm a Bond fan. I really do think this is arguably his best performance in any film. And I know he had won the Oscar for The Deer Hunter, which was a great performance, and this really made the film itself, A View to a Kill, have more precedence, because here you have an Oscar-winning great actor playing the villain. But he has fun with the role, but he invests such a particular quality to Zoran that Zoran becomes more than just the traditional villain. And here he doesn't laugh, he doesn't gloat, but just the little smile that he has as we watch the rolls sink down, and he and Mayday are watching Bond die slowly and enjoying it. It's just has a slight touch of the perverse, and he grabs her hand, and it's almost like a romantic couple by the lake, but just watching the two men they just killed. And this has become iconic, the idea of Bond using the tire valves to have, essentially an escape air bottle. And I love that it probably would not work this way, Bond being able to see Mayday and Zoran and actually share a kiss as they watch the death of these two men, the funeral, as it were. But I love the idea Bond is able to see them and is, just barely surviving. Kind of going back to the little bit I love in For Your Eyes Only, when Bond has lost the ATAC and he and Melina barely survive, and they watch the boat carrying Christados and the ATAC go off as they survive the keel hauling sequence. Now, this becomes a little stretch of the film where we don't have Bond for a while, which is interesting, a bit different, and also giving us, Zoran's backstory as well, because here we see General Gogol appear, and we are told that Zoran started out as a KGB agent, and thus later on we're able to piece together that, he went rogue for himself, developed the idea for Project Mainstrike after becoming a rich industrialist, and he's not following his control orders, so he's a rogue ex-KGB agent that they can't control, and Gogol can't admit that because it would be an embarrassment and also, jeopardize their own plans. So that's why Gogol appears sort of out of his element, and he's, come and appeared before Zoran, and when his goons are, taken in, Zoran could actually just have him killed. And it allows this moment to play out where Mayday picks the guy up, and they're just totally at Zoran's mercy. So he could literally wipe out the head of the KGB here, but then doesn't even really think about it and just shrugs his shoulders because it would just cause him more hassle at this point to eliminate him. So he's able to laugh off the classic spy cliche line, "No one ever leaves the KGB." And you see him dwell on this for a moment as Gogol walks away. And then we immediately go into the wonderfully perverse rendering of a traditional boardroom meeting. This, of course, is the moment where everybody likes to point out that there's, a lot of similarities to Goldfinger, and that this is a version of Goldfinger talking about his plot to break into Fort Knox, talking to the various gangsters, but just transposed to the business world. And of course, the 80s were the rise of commercial interests and, the idea of the yuppies being everywhere. So in this sense, Zorin is sort of painted as a sort of wealthy young industrialist character, very much like what would become personified in films like Wall Street. But it's, I think, a very smart idea to tie into things that were going on and to give it the trappings of reality. But there's such a dark undercurrent because we know Zorin is a psychopath. And although he's talking about, business terms, when he says, "I propose to end the domination of Silicon Valley," we know he means something far worse than that. And these poor businessmen have no exact idea, and I don't think they're actually told that part of the plot. I've always wondered, are they let in on all of Project Mainstrike? But Zorin's demands are, off the charts when you think about it, because it's the ridiculous payoff and half our net profits. And again, if you look at the gusto Zorin has here, what Walken does with the performance, he has this mischievous glint in the eyes and this half smile that continually pops out. He's almost laughing at points because it's as if Zorin is just amused, and he gets carried away with his own genius and his own playing of this role. And of course, when he realizes, one man doesn't want to go in for it and sends him off to meet his maker, the nonchalance he does it with. And of course, the door opens and we hear the iconic Stromberg elevator noise from The Spy Who Loved Me, which that means, we obviously know this man is not long for this earth. But when you hear that little chime, which was what was used on the elevator of The Spy Who Loved Me in Atlantis for Stromberg to drop people into the shark pool, well, now we have the reveal of the Zorin blimp, which becomes the primary method of transport for Zorin, because why not have your own personal blimp instead of a plane or helicopter? And we get a nice little intimate moment there where Zorin winks at Mayday. And again, it's a nice suggestion that they do have a relationship together, which makes Mayday think that it is a two-sided relationship, which of course is revealed to not be. Now, this is the title drop of the film, using the A View to a Kill title, which usually causes most people to groan. Most people feel title usages are a bit too on the nose and fourth wall breaking, but it's nicely done because, of course, you have the view of San Francisco. But the idea of the title and how it ties into the film, I've always felt it means literally a view to a killing in the market, in that sort of sense, a business sense. Now, here at Fisherman's Wharf, I do want to point out really quickly, apparently Maud Adams from Octopussy and the Man with the Golden Gun visited the set and is an extra somewhere in the film. Some people think she's there on the tram when Bond gets off, and some people think that she's walking in the background when Bond is meeting his CIA contact. But it's still, I don't think anybody's exactly sure about where she is. I think she's probably the woman on the tram, but she has a hat on and stuff. But it's just fun to note because that makes her, appearing in 3 James Bond films, which is a record for a Bond actress in that sense, in terms of, being a leading Bond actress and then coming back 2 further times. And now we get the payoff of the photos from Bond's Ring camera, which are now, giving nice little tidbits about some of Zorin's associates, which help add up to a clearer picture of there being something much more nefarious going on. And this will point Bond into talking with the local fishermen and investigating the Zorin oil pumping plant, and then discovering the usage of water. What I like about this setup is Bond is using mundane clues. He's talking about, the idea that the fishermen's livelihoods have been ruined and they've been complaining in local courts and it's been going nowhere because, of course, Zoran has a lot of pull with his great financial means. But it's things other people had overlooked, and it's always what's hidden inside the mundane, everyday life events that are, always going to be far more nefarious than what they appear to be on the surface, which is something that Fleming did frequently in his novels, particularly the idea of Bond and villain meeting and Bond investigating one thing, but it being revealed to be a far more nefarious scheme the villain has going on. Which, of course, happens in this film with Zorin, and most famously happened to Goldfinger, which is another nod to Goldfinger and the traditional Bond formula idea in terms of the setup and construction. But again, that also leads most people to just accuse A View to a Kill to be a lazy rehashing of Goldfinger's plot structure, which I think is unfair. It is definitely modeled in the usage of traditional Bond formula ideas and trying to advance some Goldfinger plot ideas into the mid-'80s, but I don't think it's fair to call it a complete Goldfinger rehashing. Now, originally there was another deleted sequence here where Bond went out with some of the fishermen who were protesting the Zorin plan. It wasn't really necessary, but had it remained in the film, it would have been just an extension of that scene where Bond is participating in the seemingly mundane everyday events that are disguising what there is actually going on. And this is a really nice little sequence. Again, it's very simple, but Bond is in mortal peril. He is encountering these other people who are obviously eavesdropping and surveilling Zorin. Of course, it's revealed to be, Soviet agents working at the directions of General Gogol, who is trying to figure out what Zorin is up to and stop him if necessary, because he is a KGB agent that has ignored his protocols. I have to admit, I've always wondered, okay, if you see this sort of pipeline and Bond is trying to investigate stuff, probably not the best idea to climb in, to swim inside this thing with the grate over it, as is revealed when the propeller gets started in a moment to run the test. And of course, this is the exact point in time when they happen to be testing the equipment. But it becomes, again, real mortal peril for Bond, and he barely manages to survive. It allows the tension to really play out, and also being intercut with Zorin talking about, there must be no delays for this Project Main strike. It's not a ticking clock as of yet, but we know that the actual plan of the villain is already in motion and forthcoming. Again, John Barry proves that he is the master of these sequences because he allows the tension to build, but he plays up the somber quality of it. So he's not making the music frenetic, but he allows it to build literally along with the intake pipe pressure. We see the gauge going up and the music builds up, and so does the speed of the propeller and the increasing desperation of Bond to try and get out of there. And again, it's not a Q gadget that saves him, but his own ingenuity by dumping his air tank, which allows him to escape, shuts down the propeller, but also that means he now can no longer swim away. He'll have to surface because he's sacrificed his air tank. And again, you can see the desperation on Roger's face. Bond has just barely survived this. It was quite possible the air tank would not have stopped the propeller. And it now becomes very helpful that this surveillance team was there because Bond will be able to escape when one of them is caught and then assumed to be the person who dumped the tank in the pipe. So it gives Bond a perfect cover that, thus Zorin doesn't think it was Bond because he's caught one of Gogol's agents. The only reason he's caught is because he decides to take the time to plant a limpet mine. I do like the instances where Zorin is a hands-on villain. He personally takes the bashed apart tank in his hands, and of course will just directly order the death of this man. And of course, what's revealed to be Polo Nova, she just swims off to leave her comrade to whatever demise. But Bond stays on. He lingers and sees Zorin kill him in a horrible way by throwing him into the propeller that almost just killed Bond. And of course, this guy should know that he is not long for this world, so he should just let the mine blow and refuse to disarm it. And we hear the machinery start up. We see Zorin stare down. We see the smile come across Christopher Walken's face. And then with just a slight nod of the head, we know the horrible fate of this agent. And this is a classical Bond moment that goes back to scenes such as in Thunderball with Quist going into the shark pool and the water turning red, and would meet its full conclusion in the most gruesome death in the series 2 films later when we see Sanchez throw Milton Crest into the tank in License to Kill. Now, originally, the idea was to have the Paula Ivanova character be a return cameo for the XXX character of Anya Amasova, played by Barbara Bach in The Spy Who Loved Me. That it's a cute idea. It would have been kind of nice, but I think it also might have been a little too on the nose, and it just didn't work out for whatever reason. They, of course, allude to Bond and Paula Ivanova having a greater history together and a backstory. But I like Fiona Fullerton in this role, and she has a nice chemistry with Roger, and the idea comes across. So it didn't necessarily have to be XXX, and it works just fine. I just hate that she disappears for the rest of the film. This is the one bit they have together, and I was, the idea of Bond operating with another of his stature is always great, and had it been XXX, it would have been even more terrible that she just disappears after this point, because you would have been like, oh, it would have been like a partial Spy Who Loved Me reunion, and we would have wanted more. Now, this leads into the bathhouse scene, which, of course, has now been, lampooned in Austin Powers, but it's another one of these really great scenes in the film where you have Bond operating on all fronts, and there's a lot of duplicitous dialogue where Bond is trying to get information about what KGB agents were doing, surveilling Zorin, while not giving information away about his own investigation. And of course, Pola is doing the same thing. And they get to enjoy each other's company once more. And we get this nice bit of dialogue giving the character's backstory that originally Pola was sent to seduce Bond, and Bond smelled the rat, as it were. And they still enjoyed each other's company anyway. We get this back and forth about how Bond sending her red roses, indicating knowing that she was a Soviet agent sent to seduce him. And then that it was at the ballet is a nice touch, setting up Bond switching over to actually having a cassette of Tchaikovsky, which of course is done to set up his stealing of the Zorin main strike recording surveillance tape they had made. But it's a nice bit of sleight of hand, harkening back to Bond switching the egg, the auction in Octopussy. But also, I like the idea, the character beat that Bond meeting up with Polo again, thinking about their previous meeting at the ballet, that in renting this and but getting other cassettes, he would have gotten a cassette of Tchaikovsky. And there's something cheeky about the line getting cut off. The bubbles tickle my Tchaikovsky. It's just something I've always loved about that line. It's an implied double entendre. It's just so strange. I've always liked it. And of course, it's a literal steamy scene. I've always wondered, where exactly do you find, hot tub rooms for rent like that? I guess only in San Francisco. And of course, because it's a Tchaikovsky cassette, that allows the opportunity to use dramatic portions of the classic Swan Lake music, which immediately makes you think of the early days of Universal horror films, but it just makes everything more dramatic. And I love that, Pola slips away and steals the cassette back, and Bond is talking about sending her red roses, but knows she's running out anyway. And then he comes out to the dramatic strains of Swan Lake. Just, again, that music automatically makes anything feel more dramatic. And of course, now we're shown that it is Gogol who has followed them around. And while this is not the most convincing car setup, we at least get the headlights behind them. And the wonderful bit here that Bond has switched the tape out for the background music. And Walter Gotell's expression is just priceless when his eyes sort of bug out and he turns and stares at her. But what's great is if you look closely, the cassette is the actual cassette body. So Bond must have snapped open the cassette and literally swapped the actual tape reels inside out. I don't know when he would have had time to have done that, but it's just another little thing that I've noticed after seeing this film a great number of times. Now we're brought into San Francisco City Hall and the Hal character, and Bond once again under his second cover identity of the film, the reporter James Stock. And it's, again, a point of distinction I really think is important to make, that again, it's still Roger Moore. It's still Roger Moore's Bond in the way he's playing Bond in this film, but it's a second assumed identity, and it is played a bit differently, certainly from what we got in the St. John Smythe performance. So this is a Bond performance where you have not one but two cover identities, even though both are minor and are over and done with after a period. And that makes the interesting bit where, Bond has introduced himself as one person to Stacey Sutton, encounters her again, and keeps up that charade until that is exposed, and then he presents his second cover identity, which then gets exposed, and then he has to admit who he really is. And, of course, her appearance here is a surprise. We get the nice bit where Bond is keeping the door held open, which pisses off everybody else in the elevator car. He just wants to go home for the day. And here is the other Indiana Jones connection of the film. These are the famous City Hall steps, which were utilized at the ending, the additional bit of footage shot for Raiders of the Lost Ark that was added on last minute when it was Marcia Lucas who realized that Marion Ravenwood disappears from the film. So it's interesting to see, and think, in terms of a timeline, had Bond been there earlier, it would have been Indy standing there. This is another one of those nice transitional scenes where Bond is following Stacey, and we get the first appearance of the more somber rendering of John Barry using the Dance Into the Fire refrain of the main title song. And it becomes the love theme of sorts for Bond and Stacey. We get the first flute-driven version of it where Bond talks to her at Zorin's party, but here it's much more somber. And it helps to disguise the fact that Bond is in a very plain Ford car driving around, but obviously it's the only thing they had at the rental agency. And there we get the foreground shot of the gun coming into frame, which indicates, of course, that Bond is going to break into Stacey's house, but there are other goons outside waiting to break in with far more nefarious intentions. Here's one of the bits of interesting product placement. It's a Sharper Image card that has a lockpick in it to, allow Bond access. Obviously from Q Branch, but the disguise is that it's Sharper Image. So that's a nice intrinsic bit of product placement that doesn't, stick out and clobber you over the head with its obviousness. And it's a nice reveal that Bond breaks into the nice, large historical home only to find that it's completely bare inside, which may be something you don't notice at first, but it ties into the idea that Stacey later says, she's bankrupted herself and sold everything to keep up the rigged proxy fight with Sorensen. There is the major jump scare of the film, the sudden cat running through with a loud screech. That's the John Glenn trademark animal jump scare, which again is something I don't really like jump scares. It's not really necessary, but that is something that John Glenn loved doing, and it's in every single one of his 5 Bond films somewhere. Most usually it's a pigeon. And this is a nice bit where, Bond hears the shower running, and in an interesting reverse of The Man with the Golden Gun with meeting Andrea Anders in her hotel room, Bond goes to the shower, and Stacey shows a bit of intelligence that she set up this trap. She realized somebody was following her, and she assumes that Bond is a Zorin stooge. Now he reveals himself as James Stock, so now he's putting on the second cover and uses the $5 million check he found as a method of trying to provoke her and keep her from calling the police. Of course, knowing the line is being cut and then hearing the footsteps out and seeing the shadow, and lets Bond know that, there are other players on the scene now. So this is a nice little scene. We see Bond using what's at his disposal, and then but there's still this element of desperation to this, where Bond is really having to fight for it with these goons, and now he has a weapon that's totally useless, with the great line about it being loaded with rock salt. Now you tell me. But again, John Barry's score becomes really dramatic. Of course, you have to wonder why Bond doesn't just use his Walther PPK if necessary, but it becomes just a quick battle of fisticuffs. Now, of course, if you look here very closely, you can spot some usage of stunt doubles where, again, some of the editing is a bit looser in one or two places. So, again, if you really want to scrutinize, you can spot the stunt double for Roger Moore in a few places. And some people want to accuse some of the moves of being too spry too agile for an older man. I want to mention there really quick, when Stacy goes to crown the guy with her grandfather's ashes, John Barry actually quotes himself. He quotes a bit of the pre-title music for Thunderball with the horns. So that's a moment where he's quoting Thunderball. And Thunderball and Honor Majesty's Secret Service are two of, if not his two most darkly tinged Bond scores. So A View to a Kill not only references OHMSS, but Thunderball musically as well, which is befitting because this is John Barry returning to that darker, more desperate style of music that he specifically did on certain Bond films. And it is really refreshing to see him come back to that and how he picks up on the whole film having this increased desperation for Bond. He's older. He's not able to perform as physically well as the past. And he's also dealing with Zorin, who is completely unhinged and without remorse or morals or the typical Bond villain rules as have been established. Now, this becomes another one of these wonderful little transitional scenes that I just adore, because it gives Bond a sense of humanity. He cooks for Stacy, which, again, some people don't like, but this has a little joke inside of it because he cooks her a quiche, and it's a pun on what was a popular book at the time, which was Real Men Don't Eat Quiche, written by Bruce Fierstein, who ironically would then be brought on to write on 3 of the 4 Pierce Brosnan Bond films, starting with GoldenEye. But Bond, of course, is a gourmand and would know how to cook to a certain extent, and it allows him to get to know Stacy and more of her backstory, establish her character a bit more, and it feels human, and it allows time for things to breathe. And we get the explanation of the $5 million payoff, and then when Stacy rips up the check, it again gives her character some real grit, and it impresses Bond because she literally just rips up $5 million like that and tosses it in the air. Again, it's a small little scene. Yes, it allows breathing time between action sequences, but now we cut back to later in the evening, more wine being consumed, and the return of the absolutely spellbinding John Barry cue with the very somber rendering of Dance into the Fire. And of course, we have a candle burning in the scene, and it's setting up the idea of the building possible romance between Bond and Stacy as well. But again, it's moments like these. It's they have this richer quality to them, and once again, they do really make me think of some of the Bond novels and in terms of allowing Bond to feel more human and to have actual breathing moments. And of course, this will culminate in Stacy just passing out and Bond gently tucking her in, which is almost it's a very protective gesture, and it makes Bond feel not only more human, but the great gentlemanly quality that Roger Moore had so inherently really comes across here, and it's very poignant, underscored by John Barry with this gorgeous music, and it makes Bond feel human, and it's just a wonderful moment. This whole little sequence that it just makes the world feel more lived in, makes the characters more believable. It's just something I've always loved. It's very gentle, and it's a particular quality that they would carry on into the Timothy Dalton era, and it's interesting to see them trying out some of these things here. And then we go into A Fade to Black, which is something you rarely ever see in the James Bond films, but it does allow the minor tremor of the earthquake to happen. With you get a bit of the camera shake there, and we see that Bond has literally fallen asleep in the chair with the shotgun, playing guard all night. Again, back to the idea of Bond playing the gentleman hero, and with his protectiveness towards Stacy and his determination and this gentle quality in their relationship, it has always made me feel as if Bond is often said as being the modern day rendering of the classical story of St. George slaying the dragon and rescuing the fair maiden. I'm not the first nor the last to make that connection, but because of this more human and gentle quality, particularly in scenes like that, I think A View to a Kill is one of the biggest examples, or where Bond is at the closest to the classical St. George mythical figure of being the classical knight adventurer, and acting in the cause of right and justice and so on and so forth. And again, Stacy isn't innocent. She is a character caught up in events way over her head, and now has even gotten fired for her trouble and gets visibly flustered. She is a normal person. She is not a spy or a secret agent or an operative of another government. She is simply, a geologist. And now we get a nice little chat with other official representatives, and Bond is in his nice, more traditional wear with the leather jacket, which will carry through the ending of the fire truck chase to come. But this sets us up for the trip into downtown and City Hall to examine records after hours. Now, apparently, originally the idea was to figure Felix Leiter into the story somewhere, but it just wound up not working out. And the trouble is that Chuck Yip is so wonderful in this film. Is this little tiny character? It's a shame he gets killed off because he doesn't really get all that much to do. And here again, we see Mayday's penchant for hiding in the back of cars and strangling guys. He did have a really great anecdote that when they did this. They shot the scene, and they first did it with a stand-in, and then they realized they needed a better close-up. So they got Grace Jones to do it, and she got so into the role that he complained. It was like, if we'd done another take, she would have strangled me for real. It was a lot more violent because she got too into it. Again, a nice shot of the iconic City Hall staircase. And then, of course, I've always loved the idea of being inside facilities after hours. And anytime you're inside a building that's still lit up, and if there's a guard at the front desk after hours, and it's like a ghost town inside, it always makes any sort of building have a different feel to it. And of course, this will be turned into a personal nightmare when Zorin captures them and sets the whole place on fire. Now, if you listen very carefully, inside the office, you hear a voice talking, and that is actually the voice of producer and co-screenwriter Michael G. Wilson making his film cameo. So he's not seen, but he is heard. And if you know Michael Wilson from all the behind-the-scenes materials, and you've heard him talk, you could very clearly recognize that's his very distinctive voice talking to somebody on the phone. I didn't notice that for the longest time until one day rewatching the film. I suddenly paused it and I'm like, wait a minute. So that is his cameo in the film as the voice on the phone. Of course, Bond finds the information, sees the map, and realizes that Main Strike refers to the old abandoned mine. And notice he's able to get it into his pocket right as they are discovered by Zorin. And here we see Zoran already using the intuitive improvisation that he alludes to later as he's piecing together Bond's motives. Bond comes back with a retort, to which Zoran replies, "You're not even depth." And you can see the smile curling back on his lips. And you can see Bond's coldness. He tells Stacy to just stop because it doesn't matter, because Zoran is a complete psychopath, and it doesn't matter whatever she tries to attempt. And if you notice at Roger's hand, Bond's hand, he's trying to hide the map. So, of course, he's disarmed, but he's been able to keep the map from being discovered. So, of course, that's how they're able to find the main strike mine later on. And it's just really fascinating to watch how Zoran constructs this entire narrative on the fly. Again, the intuitive improvisation he talks about, using his superior intellect to play Hao along, to do his bidding still, once more. And then when he's fulfilled his purpose, to eliminate him without a second thought. And that, of course, sets the stage for the scene to come, where Zoran will completely commit mass murder and personally execute every single person in the mine working for him once they have fulfilled their purpose, and then tries to do the same thing with Mayday. And the final great touch is that he switches guns and uses Bond's own PPK to execute Hal. I love the direction where Zoran finishes the sentence and then just blasts him away. Again, you see the smile in Zoran's face. You see the steeliness that Roger has, that he had in his most dramatic moments. And there's just the barely controlled vitriol that Bond has for Zoran. And then making reference to Dr. Mortner and Zoran's back history. You see Zoran process this where most people would become angry. He processes this. You see it processed through the cold, dead eyes. And then slight bemusement. And then as they go out to even gestures with his arms, with little knowing glances, it's all these little moments that add up to just an unbelievably multifaceted character. And we just get the basic idea of his backstory, but in all these little gestures that Christopher Walken adds, it makes Zoran, he's on a completely different plane to everyone else. He's in his own world that the normal logical rules don't apply. He is so far above everyone because of his IQ that he feels he is obviously superior, and then has fun and takes enjoyment in how no one can ever keep up with him. So it's his own personal private game. The entire world is his own personal private plaything for his own personal amusement, which it's just a remarkable character trait. Now, Bond and Stacy trapped in the elevator with the entire building set on fire and the cables breaking. I mean, this is legitimate real-world tension, and Bond has no gadget to save him and has to rely on simple ingenuity and speed to not only save himself, but Stacy as well. So this is a really well-constructed sequence, well-edited, completely believable because this, literally could happen. But it's also another moment that is reminiscent of a scene in a John Gardner Bond novel. In his second novel for Special Services, there's a moment where Bond and the heroine are trapped in an elevator. It's not on fire, but it's an elevator shaft, and they're barely able to survive after the villains have set up the breaking of the cable of the elevator car. And of course, it helps immensely that this is all done for real, and those are real flames. And, you have the actors actually in front of the flames, of course, with stunt people involved as well. And then they actually were able to get permission from the city to actually have flames on top of City Hall. And John Richardson and his effects team actually rigged up gas flame works that were controllable. And then with the addition of fog and smoke, we're able to suggest a full inferno blaze without endangering the historical building at all. So it's extraordinarily well done. Of course, the interior of the office corridor here was on a stage, so they could actually set the floor on fire, but it's perfectly intercut. And of course, Stacy is screaming James in this sequence and will continue to do so in the primary sequences of peril. and it can get a bit on the annoying side because she has this ability to just scream to a very large degree. But again, it must be remembered that she, as a character, is a complete innocent and is literally terrified for her life. So she can get a bit of slack for all the screaming, but she does scream James a lot. And it becomes one of the unintentional laughs of the film when Bond escapes up there and then the doors immediately close as if he's just left her to die because he's tired of her screaming. But anyway, of course, Bond will not do that and very heroically pulls her out of the flames and then will carry her down the engine ladder of the fire truck. Again, there's really nice sound design here with the flames coming up, especially in that first-person perspective shot of being Bond pulling Stacy up towards him using the fire hose. And again, this scene has real desperation. It's completely believable. It's escaping an elevator shaft on fire with no assistance from any Q gadgets, and Bond being able to survive simply on sheer skill alone. The introduction to the police chief out here and the sort of inherent comedy of the police force not being able to keep up with Bond is basically a lift of a similar idea from Diamonds Are Forever that got carried on into Live and Let Die in a bit. But of course, the fire truck chase is essentially a reprise of the Las Vegas car chase in Diamonds Are Forever, complete with the police force getting smashed up. But here, it's worked out seemingly a bit better in terms of overall pacing and Bond needing to escape because, the villain's plot is being carried out in just a few hours. And then John Barry goes over the top and scoring Bond's carrying Stacy down to its absolute maximum. So it becomes a centerpiece moment for the film. Maybe not entirely necessary. I think some of the extra shots are a bit overplayed with the guy dropping the bottle, and then if you look closely, the extra behind the hobo with the broken bottle just is so over dramatic with the little arm move. He just looks wonderfully goofy, but it's a great moment, and we get the full fanfare of the actual love theme that's been built into the score. And I like this dramatic reveal because, of course, they found Hal dead. They found that it was Bond's gun. Bond admits it hit his gun. And he's like, oh, well, I have a CIA contact. Oh, well, we found his body. So now Bond has no methods of proving himself in time to stop Zorin. And Stacy, the person with him, doesn't even know who he is. And I love the exchange where Bond obviously isn't going to be believed, so you see his hand is already on the fire hose because he's already having to figure out a way out of this because there's no way to prove who he is in time, and he'll be taken in for a police interrogation, and Zorin will be able to carry out his main strike scheme, which, although we still don't know the full implication of it, we know that since he's obviously completely unhinged and doesn't care about murdering anybody that he comes into contact with, it can't possibly be good. And Bond has to admit, my real name is Bond. You have to trust me. Which, of course, Stacy has no real reason for, since this is now the third identity he's given her. So this becomes, again, a reworking of the Diamonds Are Forever chase in Vegas, but again, I feel it's much better woven into the film, and there's a legitimate reason for Bond escaping in this way and not just submitting to police custody to then later prove who he is, because there's simply no time, and his CIA contact is gone as well. So I know most people are not going to try and look at the logical reasons for action set pieces, but I think it's always helpful when they're there and it makes sense when you stop to think about it for a second. And they do have a nice bit of fun with this, but they don't let it become too goofy. And we now kick into John Barry's music cue, which is right back to the action theme set up by the pre-title sequence, and you get that desperation throughout. And we get the cutaways to the locking lever and the line before about the ladder being unlocked, setting up that, if Bond doesn't hurry up and get to the rear of the truck, it's going to start swinging around, which of course it does. So again, even the humorous bits of the cops crashing around, well, that impact is what leads to the ladder being firmly unlocked. And I have to say, the stunt work in this is really well done when you literally look at it's a guy hanging on a fire engine ladder, actually going down the road and swinging around. And there are frequent moments where it becomes a one-handed grip of the stunt performer. And of course, it has to cut to Roger on a process stage, and the process footage on the projection isn't exactly always convincing, but it's not held too long, and Roger sells those moments. It's a very difficult thing to do when you're obviously just hanging on a prop inside a soundstage with some projection going behind you. But he does get the requisite amount of energy into it, and he sells the sequence. And even the little bits of comedy are not enough to derail the impending sense of doom that's going on. So Bond is able to get to the rear of the engine, and the truck is still being driven by Stacy, and she seems completely in over her head. So it doesn't help that she's the one driving the primary front of the engine. Again, John Barry just scores this sequence for everything that it's worth. So it really becomes far more dramatic, and it helps to undercut the little bits of humor, which are kept very small. And that's key to making this much more impactful, because when you compare this to the Diamonds Are Forever sequence, that one is pretty much played entirely for laughs. And the laughs are great, but it doesn't really have any drama to it, because we know Bond's going to get away, and there's no real reason for him to run from the cops in Diamonds Are Forever. There's no any sort of ticking clock like the villain's plot's gonna happen. And of course, Felix Leiter is there in Vegas, so Bond could easily explain it away. But here again, he can't do that, and there is a ticking clock already. And now we get the wonderful business with the separating bridge, and of course the fire truck going over. It can only do it when the bridge isn't at a higher point, and just barely manages to do so. And then this bit with the car that gets stuck on top, and then eventually does the complete vertical crash down into the other cars. It's a really striking moment. It's just wonderfully executed, and of course actually done for real, which helps to sell any sequence. But it's just one of those moments in a Bond film that it becomes really striking. And even though we're pausing the story to look at this, it's just really well done. So, and very intently funny, but also very visually striking, because we get the build up and then the fall down and the actual crash. And then the capper of the scene becomes the grumbling police captain has his own car destroyed by the workings of the bridge. I do love the little bit here that Stacy has fallen asleep through all this, and Bond and Stacy have just driven through the night in a stolen fire truck to get to the main strike area. And another indicator that something is up, they see some explosives. Stacy says that's enough to supply them for a month, and then an entire truck of more explosives shows up. The way Roger sells that by just putting on a fireman's helmet and says the fire's on your rear end. Again, there's just a little bit, there's a lived-in quality to this film, and again, they've ostensibly driven outside the city in the middle of the night. It's now daybreak, but there is something going on, because we see Zorin's armed guards everywhere, and they've got all these explosives coming in, far more than what would be required for a typical work environment. And there, of course, Bond is, infiltrating Even though it's just a simple job site, he's still infiltrating a villain's area, even though, again, it is far more mundane than what we've come to expect. It's not a hollowed out volcano base, but again, there is something to that once again, it makes the environment feel much more lived in, and this would be how a villain would get away with something, by making it as mundane and simple and camouflaged by the obvious everyday as possible. And that is Zoran's goal, because he has every contingency planned for and a perfect cover, which, when we get the full impetus of what Main Strike plans to be, and when Zoran sails away in his airship, he has, covered every contingency. There are no witnesses, and because he's killed all of them. And I love the way that Bond has to come up with one or two little gag lines to try and explain away the people who might question Stacy as a minor. And of course, in the traditional Bond sense, they use the machinery to camouflage themselves and enter the villain's lair, as it were. There's just something about the shot of what Stacy says. Do you know what I'm sitting on? And the shot of her rear end on a bunch of explosives. It's just one of those little moments that's always made me chuckle for some reason. And now we are shown the Main Strike set for the first time. This was Peter Lamont's big showstopper set for the film, built on the 007 stage. Of course, the interesting production fact is the 007 stage actually burned down during the production of the Ridley Scott film Legend. And so they had to actually rebuild it from scratch, but they were lucky that the original construction company had the plans and techniques that improved so much that they could literally rebuild the 007 stage as it was, but in much less time. But that meant that Peter Lamont started constructing the set before they were finished, so he was building it, and there was no roof, and they were building the walls of the 007 stage. So he was able to complete it, but it did cause a slight delay in production. But it's just amazing he was able to build this gigantic set literally without the stage around it. They were just rebuilding the stage at the same time. And I always like the way that Bond and Stacy are hiding around and being able to observe, the goings-on inside Main Strike. Much in the traditional sense, when Bond infiltrates the gigantic villain lair or the final base, he's able to look at the inner workings and find methods of infiltration. And, we saw that in Moonraker. We saw a bit of that in Spy. And that goes all the way back to Dr. No, when Bond infiltrates the final reactor room. First, he kills Chang, and then he takes his, radiation suit, and then looks at the inner workings. So that's a classic element of the Bond formula: the infiltration of the final layer, and then the reveal of the plot while Bond is observing. Now we get the ticking clock with the actual bomb device. Although, again, very interestingly, we don't know the full Zoran plot yet, and we don't know what the bomb is going to be used for. We know it's obviously not good. Now, the idea of Zoran doing all of this to flood the San Andreas Fault and cause a gigantic earthquake or a natural cataclysm to destroy Silicon Valley, again, has been rightfully pointed out as a reworking of the Goldfinger idea of irradiating all the gold inside Fort Knox. But here, again, Zoran has worried about contingency plans, and he's covered himself by making it look like a natural event, a calamity. Natural causes is said later. So, again, I think this can be attributed to his extreme IQ, that he would have gone to this level of planning to make sure that no one could possibly suspect someone of actually causing an earthquake and causing a natural calamity. And so his takeover of the microchip market would be seen as just natural, because he would step in to fill the void of Silicon Valley, as it were. And of course, it shows he's so completely psychotic that he would simply murder everyone in Silicon Valley. And again, people have pointed out that it is similar to how Goldfinger doesn't care about killing the 60,000 inhabitants at Fort Knox. But of course, this is on a much larger scale. And again, the idea of Zorin having a perfect cover that he's devised, his plan can't be possibly traced to, actual human interference, that it is a natural occurring event that has happened, is I think a great building on that sort of Goldfinger structure idea. So again, I think it's very unfair to just say it's a tired rehashing of Goldfinger's ideas, because they have built on it and they've built it into Zorin's characterization. And originally, the idea was that they were toying around with Zorin using Halley's Comet somehow to do this instead of this idea of blowing the fault with a bomb, but they realized that would be far too much in the science fiction fantasy realm, and it would really date the film as well. So I think it's interesting that helped them make it much more believable and befitting of Zorin's character. But of course, they didn't realize at the time, it was pointed out later, that, and a lot of people have said it's very similar to Lex Luthor's plan in Superman the movie, in terms of his plan to change the coast of California with an earthquake in a land scheme. And Michael G. Wilson admitted later on he heard that, looked at the film, and was like, "Oh, I totally forgot about that." So it was unintentional, but I think it's really befitting because it is directly tied into Zorin's characterization. Again, Zorin is very hands-on. He breaks down the door himself, fires after Bond himself. And I just love the way that Christopher Walken delivers the line, "Get him." He's almost exasperated because he has all these people and everybody's stuck standing around. They freeze. And he just you get the whole notion of, do I have to do all the work myself? I've always wondered, though, Connolly sees Zorin set the bomb. It's obviously set for about an hour. So, if everybody's still working and Zorin's now closed the entrance, wouldn't Connolly and people have already been wondering, okay, but that bomb's going to go off in an hour. Shouldn't we be leaving? But of course, it's to flood the fault and obviously not the rest of the mine. But Zorin's contingency plan is Scarpine planting that, that thermite bomb or charge earlier on that is radio controlled. Now, of course, Mayday and Jenny and Penho go down, and obviously they were with Zorin, so it's not exactly clear whether Zorin always intended on killing the three of them. It's possible that he maybe did not intend on it, and just because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time and Zorin had to be on schedule, that they were sacrificed in those terms, because it just wasn't worth delaying his plan to, save his lover, really, if because that's what Mayday is ostensibly, or if it was his intention all along to kill them with the rest of the miners and Zorin workers, and that they were unimportant. You could read it either way. Personally, I think it is more of the former, that Zorin just felt it was a calculated risk and a sacrifice he was willing to take because he really didn't care about any of them, and he didn't care about Mayday either. And that's the notion that Mayday realizes when she has been left to be killed left with the rest of the dead that Zorin has murdered, and that's what causes her allegiance to switch. And she has a great moment of humanity. She becomes angry she's been betrayed, and then realizes that, that Bond is her only other compatriot in this scenario, because they are the only two people alive here. And the music becomes more dramatic. The editing starts to build up, and then we get this incredible sequence. It's time to flood the fault. And Zorin goes to set off the charge, and this is where it starts to dawn on Connolly, and a convenient coincidence. We see the malice on Zorin's face. Scarpine knocks Connolly off the precipice there, and then the way that Christopher Walken just nonchalantly throws the switch to set off the charge. After waiting just that extra second, then he just throws it with a little open mouth smile. And then we get this scene of all of these miners being killed. And it's intercut here with the fishermen on top of the lake, and we get to see the actual water draining, which was shot in an estuary. But that does help give us a good visual of all of that body of water descending into the mine and then leaving the dry bed above. And this whole sequence is really well done for ostensibly a mining disaster sequence. It's well done, and it's great when you see the panic on Jenny's face as she sees the wall of water that is to be her doom. Again, some really nice sound design for the Dolby Stereo era. And this becomes the scene that a lot of people comment on that Roger Moore himself thought was too violent for a Bond film, but is the complete villainy of Zorin in one scene when he takes an Uzi and just machine guns down every man that has been working for him, his entire private workforce. He personally massacres and does so laughing maniacally but with still a cool detachment. So he alternates between being detached and just laughing, and it becomes just an unbelievably cold and striking scene. It's one of the great moments of Bond villainy in the entire series, and it obviously, it's very simple. It's just Christopher Walken firing away with an Uzi, but it's just so striking and really sticks with the viewer, and again, just underlines his total psychotic streak. He is so completely unhinged that, again, he feels the need to act personally and just massacre the men himself. It's not enough to just trap them in a flooded mine and kill them that way. No, he has to make sure they're dead, and he is going to do so personally and enjoy every minute of it. And of course, Scarpine, as his trusted right hand, just is right there along with him. And this becomes the point at which where Mayday has realized her mistake and even allying herself with Zorin. And it's wonderful how, again, Grace Jones was not really, she had been in the Conan sequel, but she was not a great experienced actress at this point. But she's able to sell the emotion of the scene. And now we get the classic Zorin line, right on schedule, right back into the businessman motif. And it's so darkly humorous. It's one of the great Bond one-liners, and is delivered by the villain. But again, what makes Mayday's transition so effective is she's been such a menacing presence throughout the whole film in the traditional Bond henchman sense. But now we've seen Zorin completely murder everyone, betray everyone, and betray Mayday, who was his lover. So she has been betrayed, left to die, her friends have been murdered, and now she realizes she has been completely duped by Zorin, leading to, and I thought that creep loved me. And it's also the most dialogue she's had in the film to this point, so that also helps to really serve her deep emotion and anger and rage at this point. So it gives us more to play with, and it makes her transition to a Bond ally so much more believable, because of course it's an ally. She's an ally of necessity, and she's stopping Zorin's plot. She's removing the charge and the bomb and helping Bond out of revenge and rage, and she's been betrayed. So, of course, Zorin should have made sure Mayday was dead if he wanted his plan to succeed. And, of course, Zorin has his blimp ready to go. And it's a nice reveal of the blimp coming out of the building, but, of course, it probably would definitely take a lot longer than 5 minutes to inflate an entire blimp. But, of course, again, Zorin has planned for every contingency, and now we'll be able to just observe the genius of his creation, as Dr. Mortner will get to do in observing his progeny just, go to even greater heights. And I also love that we see, Jenny's corpse and all the corpses of the miners everywhere. So it helps to sell the gravity of what Zorin has done, and also it's very morbid because Bond and Mayday are trapped in this mine. They have to stop the bomb, but they're just surrounded by nothing but corpses. And of course, once again, we get a great maniacal Zoran laugh as the blimp rises, and he gets to smile gleefully at this turn of events because his plan cannot be stopped at this point. Everyone is dead, and now he just has to wait and allow his genius master plan to unfold before his eyes and to just really take such pleasure from it. Again, we're allowed to savor this along with Zoran. Zoran is savoring this moment, and we get the shot of Silicon Valley, and he's so consumed in his greatness that, nothing can stop it. And now we get the line, greatest cataclysm in history, all attributed to natural causes. And then Zoran laughs once again at his own perceived genius. Then we get the nice touch of him reaching up to give Mortner that nice little touch there, and again suggesting this sort of twisted father-son dynamic they have between scientist and progeny. And I've also always loved the fact that Bond and Mayday have to piece this together. Mayday's going to lower him down, and Bond goes to defuse the bomb, but then she tells him that it's booby-trapped, and he can't do that. So already she is assisting and helping Bond in things he would not know. And we thus don't have a repeat of Octopussy with Bond defusing a bomb. He's unable to, which only helps to increase the tension because the ticking clock is about to run out. And the only way to get the bomb is to use this hand-operated winch, which takes a lot of time. I've always felt this set here of all of the bags of explosives, it's just a really dramatic, well-done set by Peter Lamont. Of course, suggesting a cave, a big cavern, and it's just loaded with all these bags of explosives. Also, the back and forth where Mayday insists that Bond get on, and Bond is so determined to prevent this calamity that he's, almost sacrificing himself. He's saying, take the bomb and go on with it, and I'll just stay down here, and hopefully you'll come back for me, But Mayday insists, and that's how Bond, of course, gets out of there. But I love that little moment, too, where he insists on, just go ahead anyway without me. Of course, we intercut with Stacy running around outside, so she's still outside running around. And Roger allows a good amount of desperation to come through in his voice when he's, just shouting, keep going. And again, the timer is about to run out. And we're getting less and less cutbacks to the ticking clock, but it is there. You also see how freezing it is in this set because everybody's breath is just letting out huge amounts of steam. Again, John Barry just underscoring the desperation of this sequence, and now it's going to be compounded by they get it to the cart, they have to clear the cart, then they have to disconnect it from the winch and move the winch out of the way, which takes more time as well. And of course, if it goes off before they get it outside, it will set off the explosives below. But now this is going to the final hurdle becomes the handbrake on the train cart doesn't work and has to be held down. And this is where Mayday just realizes that she's going to have to sacrifice herself and insists on doing so. And Bond pleads for her to jump. But this becomes Mayday's act of final defiance. She says, get Zoran from me. But it is literally giving her former lover the middle finger and giving the coup de grace to his plan. You see she's laughing. She's enjoying this. And this final act of defiance, and you see Zoran he just says her name. She becomes quiet, and then the explosion goes off. Which actually is a quite massive explosion. And then you just see his eyes go wide for the first and only time. And you see his hands go to his head. And the entire Project Mainstrike, his master plan, has been destroyed. And interestingly, not by Bond. Through Bond's actions, of course. But it is ultimately Mayday who undoes Zoran's plans. So it is Zoran's own ego, his writing off of Mayday, his rejection of her, that undoes his great master plan. So it is really Zoran's own fault, and Mayday got her final revenge as the spurned lover. Now, I don't. It's a classical idea of the villain recapturing the the damsel in distress at the end of the film to set up the final climax. But it is a bit of a stretch that Stacy does not hear the giant blimp coming up behind her. This is a core tenet of adventure storytelling. It has to happen, but you would think that she would have looked around behind her. It's one of those moments that definitely makes you just go, okay, you would have heard a giant blimp behind you. But that is, I think, rather well countered by, Bond just grabs onto the mooring rope, which again seems like not maybe the best idea because, of course, how are you going to get from the mooring rope to the blimp itself? But it leads to this amazing sequence that is literally a stuntman hanging on a rope going over San Francisco towards the Golden Gate Bridge. This will get us to the conclusion on the iconic landmark. And of course, there are cutaway shots of Roger on the stage, and we get the one bit of comedy here with the final appearance of the police captain, who, of course, smashes his new car. And Bond hitting the aerial is maybe not necessary, but does help to sell the almost impossible notion that Bond is hanging on for dear life. But this here, where we get John Barry's cue come in, and just the amazing long shot of the stuntman hanging on the rope with the Golden Gate Bridge in the background. We see the wind blowing his jacket and everything. It's just, it plays out in a slower pacing. It allows the tension to build, and we know this is going to be the final, hand-on-hand climax with the villain. This is what the whole film is built towards, but it's this nice pause, as it were, between the main strike explosion and the fight on top of the bridge that allows the emotional quality to build. And now Bond is able to just barely get the mooring rope tied around to anchor the blimp at the Golden Gate Bridge for just long enough to try and stop it. Again, it's Bond using his ingenuity and Bond using what's available and his own wits instead of a Q gadget, which is always what you want to do in these films. We get a classic imitatable Chris Walken line there. More power, do it now. More, do it. There are a number of Zorn moments like that become, part of any Christopher Walken imitation repertoire. And of course, what really sells this sequence and makes it amazing is that they actually got permission to go and shoot on the Golden Gate Bridge, which was, given practically never to anyone. And they actually went up there with stuntmen and cameramen, and it's a very tricky location, very high up, and the actual, girders are very narrow, which I don't know if you necessarily get that how difficult of a location is in the final fight. It's still a good fight, but they did have to, sort of scale back the intensity of all the things they wanted to do simply because the permissions they got were so limiting. So I do think that kind of affects some of the actual, final staging of the fisticuffs, but the intensity is still there 100%. And I think it's just compounded by the intensity of both Roger and Christopher Walken's performances. We get a nice little bit of the villain sending out the henchman to kill Bond. The henchman pauses for a second, but it is Stacy who knocks out Scarpine. So she's at least still trying her best to do stuff. And I love that Zorin's final weapon isn't a fancy gadget, but he grabs the fire axe and he comes at Bond with a fire axe. It's just a striking image, and of course they're having to step around very carefully because this is an extraordinarily perilous location in real life. And again, the fact that we have actual footage of real stuntmen on top of the Golden Gate Bridge really sells this sequence. They did shoot VistaVision plates for all of the projection footage. Of course, VistaVision being large format, it has a greater density and should look much better, but you always have that that slight haziness that comes from having to go on stage. But for what it is, it's a sequence that still works really well because the mixture, the addition of actual footage. So you have the stuntmen here and the long shot on top of the actual bridge. John Barry's pounding score, but again, the emotional context of the scene has been built up for the entire film, and Zorin is literally a maniac that must be stopped. And then here, in another one of those interesting pauses, when Zorin is going to go over the edge, we have this moment where he pauses. Mortner's crying like a concerned parent, and Zorin laughs. He laughs at the situation that he finds himself in, and then only then does he fall to his death. But it's this one particular character beat. It's this final sort of triumphant Zorin moment. He knows he's going to die, but he finds it absurd that he's at this position and that Bond is the person who's been able to defeat him, who has amused him all this time and is not of Zorin's IQ caliber, but Zorin has still been defeated and is now going to die. So it's that extra little beat that I've always really loved. And now we get to see Dr. Mortner have the rather silly idea to just start chucking sticks of dynamite, which of course doesn't go well for him, or Scarpine for that matter. And I have to admit, I've always loved the way the actors are. They're trying to get the dynamite out there, and the way that Willoughby Gray has that grin on his face right as the explosion is about to go off. It's just that it's a slightly bizarre tinge to the ending of that. We get the nice shot of the Zorin blimp exploding. We hear the explosion trail off in the background. Bond and Stacy are still stranded on top of the Golden Gate Bridge. After all that danger and excitement, they catch their breath, and Bond is completely nonplussed, and Roger's able to throw off the great, "There's never a cab when you want one." And I love the fact that it breaks the tension as such that Stacy actually cracks up, but in a believable manner. And in a way reminiscent of Octopussy, here we have Gotel again as Gogol in M's office, and we get the nice bit of Gogol revealing, on the contrary, what would we do without Silicon Valley if it were destroyed? It's a nice way to once again sort of unify the competing powers of intelligence services even though this was the tail end of the Cold War. Bond films always tried to stay less political and to try to not offend others, and it was wise and makes the films more timeless. But I always loved that sort of the inherent political struggle to do things under the table and keep it within the intelligence fields. And we have a semi-traditional ending where, Bond is presumed dead or missing, and we get one final shot of Moneypenny acting all upset. Now we get the payoff of Q's snooper, shown before. And of course, fittingly, Stacy has a cat, which is, of course, named Pussy. Now, this is a very, low-key ending for Roger Moore's tenure as Bond in his seventh and final film. But there's something about it I do really enjoy. We have the return of John Barry's somber Dance to the Fire theme, the final bit of the Bond-Stacy romance theme. And of course, Q does look like a little bit of a dirty old man. He's found Bond, and he's like, of course, that's what he's doing. And then the added gag that you may not get at first is, of course, the snooper gets covered by a towel, which Bond throws. So in a way, it's Bond throwing in the towel as Roger's tenure. And Roger's tenure ends with a little ooh, and then right smack back into the Duran Duran title song used for the end credits. And we get a shot of the Golden Gate Bridge, which, of course, is really a reference to San Francisco, really opening up the city to the Bond production. And the cooperation was such that Cubby Broccoli insisted they premiere the film there, and so they did, and it became the first Bond film to premiere there. Seeing Bob Simmons there in the credits on the stunt team, this was unfortunately the last Bond film he worked on, so this was his swan song for the series. And that means one more of the key original team. This would be the last film he worked on. Also, it's interesting that they do a slight edit of the title song here. So this is the special end title version. So it brings the film to a close. It is a lower key ending, but there's something about it that I've always appreciated, that this was Roger's final film, and it's a capstone to his career. And as Bond in the role after 7 films, it is understandable that some might prefer Octopussy as a more befitting exit for Roger. But there's just something about having this film as the last go-round. It's much more focused on character, and Bond's character in particular, that it allows us to have, another 2 hours and 10 minutes with Roger's Bond, but with all these extra moments that are not necessarily integral to the plot, but allow character depth and allow for greater character dynamics, particularly for Bond in successive rewatches. So, View to a Kill, I feel, is a film that is richer than its immediate predecessors. It's much more rewarding for repeat viewings. And again, the darker tone throughout, represented specifically by Zorin and his, various qualities of being a completely unhinged Bond villain, helps to set up what we're going to get with the Timothy Dalton era, which really picks up what A View to a Kill does and refines it, polishes it further, and takes it further along the path of trying to get back to the classical Fleming style, which was the entire point of the 1980s Bond films and the John Glenn era. So I feel it's a film that is, more confident. John Glenn is, it's his third Bond film. He's more confident as a director. Again, I can understand some people feeling the film moves too slow, it's too low key. But again, I think you need that every once in a while to change things up. And again, I think that there is a greater focus on Bond as a character, Bond as a human being, and there's a greater focus on having actual moments of humanity where Bond feels much more like a flesh and blood person and much closer to the Bond of the novels. And I should also point out the other connection to John Gardner I should make is the climax taking place on an airship. There is also a climax on a blimp airship at the end of his fourth novel, Roll of Honor, which also has a great focus on computers and technology. But that, of course, was everywhere in the 80s because it was in the midst of the computer revolution, and the entire world was slowly changing over this time period. So, I don't think that the Eon team, were specifically adapting things from some of the John Gardner novels, but they obviously were aware of them, and maybe some of those ideas stuck a little bit and stuck in some of the, like maybe Michael G. Wilson's mind, developing the screenplay, and obviously they weren't officially adapting any of the continuation books, and they never really have until recently, but. It's just interesting to note that some of the 80s films, particularly A View to a Kill, have a number of connections you can make to some of the early John Gardner continuation novels. And again, I feel Bond in this film, you get much more of a sense of him as a person, and the world feels more lived in. So while it's slower paced, I really do think it has more feeling as if it were a Bond novel, more than being a fully traditional Bond film. And that greater sense of desperation throughout the entire story, all the action sequences. Bond is older, but they're not playing it for laughs. They're playing into Roger being older, which they were already doing a bit in For Your Eyes Only. They did it a bit more in Octopussy. And here they do it again as well, but they allow it to be intrinsic to Roger's performance and how people react to him instead of playing it for laughs as they did in the unofficial film Never Say Never Again with Sean in 1983. So... again, A View to a Kill is not going to be everyone's cup of tea, but I feel it is a very rewarding film if you're willing to look at it from a serious perspective and from its historical place and historical context within not just the mid-'80s and competing films, but also the film series and the elements they were trying out here that they would further refine in the Timothy Dalton era, and the fact that they decided to stick with Roger Moore for one more film and Roger decided to come back. There were also pressures from the studio because, of course, MGM UA, MGM had bought United Artists, turned it into MGM UA, and starting with Octopussy, it became a continual battle for Cubby Broccoli to maintain full control of the Bond films without the interference of the ever-changing executives at MGM UA, which became a perpetual nightmare and eventually was part of the problem that led to the 6-year gap between License to Kill and GoldenEye, and really robbed us of the third Timothy Dalton Bond film that we never got. So That's also a concern, and it was also something MGM wanted. They wanted Roger to stay on because Octopussy was very successful. Roger had been negotiating on a per film contract basis with his agent, for each film, really starting with Moonraker after his original three-picture contract deal. So with each film, it sort of became a will he or won't he thing, and they did screen test other actors. Timothy Dalton was an idea in people's minds and was approached at various points, but ultimately Roger Moore wound up coming back for each film, and then MGM really wanted him to come back for the seventh go-round. And so A View to a Kill basically becomes the swan song for Roger in the role and allows the entire film to be a goodbye of sorts. And I think that ties in wonderfully with the idea of the older Bond, the aged Bond. The feeling of desperation meshes perfectly with the darker tonality of the entire film's story. And once again, John Barry proves that he is the absolute master of getting to the absolute heart of a film's tone and using that for his score to completely sell that and become so intrinsic to the film that his music just enhances every single sequence that it's in. And I feel this is one of his best Bond scores. And like the film and its darker tone, it really sets the stage for what we see to come in The Living Daylights 2 years down the road. So in closing, really, I guess I just really wanted to make the point that there's a lot more in A View to a Kill as a film to be enjoyed, to be, relished or savored. It's not just they went with Roger Moore for one too many films, and Roger Moore's too old, and it's too 80s, and it's too slow, and these are the usual criticisms you hear. And then if anybody's even more serious than that, they might bring up the obvious plot similarities to Goldfinger and just count that as a negative. It's a film that doesn't really ever get proper critical analysis, and particularly not always within the fan community even. I would highly recommend to anyone who has listened to this whole commentary or loves the film or wants to take a closer look at the film, there's literally a book entitled A Closer Look at A View to a Kill by Andrew McNess. It's a wonderful study of the film and its various plot points and character analysis that really tries to look at the film from not just a fan perspective, but as a film that is worth people's time and worth proper recognition and definitely worth a reconsideration to try and get away from the extreme negative idea people have of the film in their minds. They usually, it gets glossed over. It's accused of being, too one note or as not having any definable identifiers outside of the villains of Christopher Walken's Zorin and Grace Jones as Mayday, particularly. And, of course, the Duran Duran title song, because, of course, Duran Duran still has a massive fan base, and it usually gets included in many best of 1980s compilations. And that really does the film a disservice, because it is continuing with the new series tradition established on For Your Eyes Only of getting back to a more grounded Fleming style, but instead of using a lot of Fleming story elements directly in short stories, like the previous two films had a greater focus on, they didn't have as many of those this time around. And so what they did was, I think, rather cleverly blend in some intrinsic Fleming ideas from novels that hadn't quite been used. And also, they really got the more of the feeling of the James Bond novels, which I find is a really impressive feat to pull off, because any Bond fan who has actually read the novels, which unfortunately there's a great part of the fan base that has never read any of the original Fleming novels, but anyone who has read a Bond novel will tell you right off the bat that the novels are completely different in tone and character to the films in the most part, and for the most part, and so you have to look at them separately. They form sort of a concurrent line, but the film series had to find ways in 1962 to make Bond identifiable, to make him acceptable to worldwide audiences, but also to get around the general production codes and movie standards at the time. They couldn't do what Fleming put on the page, which was a far more grounded and serious human spy. So the spirit of Fleming comes up in the most serious, down-to-earth Bond adventures. And here in A View to a Kill, because there's a greater focus on character, because there's a darker storyline, and it's picking up where For Your Eyes Only and Octopussy left off and taking it a bit further, but allowing the pacing to be a bit more relaxed. Again, it really has more of the feeling of being like the James Bond of the novels. And since that is something that we so rarely see in the official Bond films, it's just something that I think is such a rare opportunity to be able to enjoy. And again, is yet another thing that sets up what we're going to get more of in the Timothy Dalton era, which really defines the idea of trying to interpret Fleming as directly as possible, and I think without question that Timothy Dalton's interpretation of Bond in his two Bond film performances is the closest interpretation to the original character that Fleming wrote on the page of his novels. But without the immediate three films leading up to Living Daylights, it would not have been as successful or as well polished or worked out at all, because over the course of the last three films of Roger Moore's tenure, and the first three of John Glenn's directed Bond films, the first three films of the 1980s John Glenn era, it establishes these parameters, it enhances them over three films, it plays around with these ideas a little bit, and it builds them. So really, they become the foundation for the Timothy Dalton era of James Bond films. And so I think it's very important to look at all five 1980s Bond films as a unified era, which you can, most clearly recognize as the John Glenn era, since he directed all five films, and they all have the same deep set knowledge of film construction, of editing, and of the real nuts and bolts, foundational core tenets of filmmaking, which of course are befitting of someone who had such a long and storied career in both the editing room and as a second unit director in and out of the Bond series before that point. So, with all that being said, A View to a Kill is a film that I enjoy revisiting every single year when I do my rewatch of the Bond series. And it's a film that whenever I hear people speak negatively of it, or especially disparagingly, when they don't really give it a chance, it really kills me, because it's a film that I think is far better and deserves far more credit than people ever give it. And it is, along with, usually looped in with Diamonds Are Forever and The Man with the Golden Gun and Moonraker, but usually those films at least do have their fans, and A View to a Kill does have its fans, thankfully, but it becomes the one of those that often gets passed over. People just assume it's bad because of the negative reputation, and it just doesn't get mentioned as much as the other so-called black sheep of the Bond series. And it's really unfair to label any of them as that, because they're all great films and they all have great strengths that again don't even get they often get overlooked even within the Bond fan community itself. So with these tracks, and this one in particular, I really wanted to go out of my way to try and not just defend the film, but try and promote what I feel are its great strengths. And I think the most important thing to note is that there's a great darkness and a real desperation to the main plot, the character arcs. John Barry picks up on this in his score. Roger Moore picks up, uses it throughout his performance. There's a greater element of danger in this film, and all of this stuff not only builds on For Your Eyes Only and Octopussy, but really sets the stage for the Timothy Dalton era. And without A View to a Kill, the Timothy Dalton era would not have been the same as it was, and it really wouldn't have been as well polished. And had Timothy Dalton come in as Bond in this film, as could have happened, and a lot of people like to write fan theory about the what ifs if he had come in on this film, I think it would have worked. I think he would have been great in it, of course, but I really don't know if it would have that same richness to it, because you do have the added fact that this is Roger Moore's final film in the series, his seventh film, and there's such an air of finality and such a level of experience that is felt, almost a world weariness in his Bond here that befits his older age. And the way he plays off of Christopher Walken, the way that Bond and Zorin play off of each other, is just so wonderfully balanced that I just don't think it would have been the same with another actor in the role in this particular film. And I think it was really important that we have A View to a Kill with the emerging darkness and even greater realism that had been hinted at in the two films before, that was going to be completely crystallized in the Timothy Dalton era to come. So that is my commentary on A View to a Kill, which is a film I adore and I enjoy every single time I return to it. And it's a film I hope that more people will look at much more seriously and with critical eyes, but also I hope people will stop nitpicking it so much, really, because I feel just as an experience, it's a richer film than what we are typically used to for a Bond film, and especially adhering to the classical established Bond formula. I think it departs from that in a number of interesting ways and really remains sort of a one of a kind, because it's Bond at a transition, because we're not just transitioning over to the next actor and a new style of Bond film, but it's also building to that in its story and tonality. And again, the Timothy Dalton era would not have been the same without A View to a Kill. If you had gone straight from Octopussy into the Timothy Dalton era, I think it was really important you had this transitional film that was not just transitional in terms of its actor, but also transitional in the way that it felt. And A View to a Kill really feels like the proper transitioning step between Octopussy and The Living Daylights. And that makes it such a rewarding experience if you're willing to let the film play out and not believe the negative hype and the overlooked quality that it's had ever since its original release, which unfortunately has sort of tarred its reputation all these years. And so hopefully if you've listened to me babble throughout the entirety of the film, you've got some enjoyment out of this, and I hope this will encourage you to maybe, look at the film a bit more seriously, just, ponder it out in your mind whenever you feel the need, as I do on a practical daily basis, because that's just how my brain works. But, as I say in all these tracks, the Bond films really are art, and they've never been properly accepted as such, and they still are not viewed in the critical world with the reverence that they should be. They're still viewed as entertainments, which of course they were designed to be, but they have become timeless and stand alone in their field and should be viewed as the artworks they have always been. And, even the naysayers and the detractors of A View to a Kill can point out issues and problems, which every film has. No work of art is perfect. No film is perfect. But I feel is a far more rewarding film experience than people give it credit for, and particularly for James Bond fans of Roger Moore's Bond, fans of Timothy Dalton's Bond, because you see the emerging core tenets to come, but also fans of the James Bond novels, because I feel you get a greater sense of the more lived-in and more human James Bond of the novels, both the Fleming novels and the continuation books, than we typically get in the general film series and the film series Bond formula. So for that reason, and the fact that it is Roger Moore's swan song, I feel it is an intensely rewarding film that really grows on you on many rewatches, and the more closely you look at it and how it is designed, the more you realize that there are special elements in there outside of just the fantastic, striking villain performances. So that's my commentary for A View to a Kill. As always, if you stuck with me through this whole track, thank you so very much. I hope this has been informative and a fun listen. And again, I encourage you to look at all of these films, in a serious manner and to enjoy them always. And hopefully you have maybe come up with a new thought on the film, or maybe if you didn't like the film very much before, hopefully this maybe encourages you to at least have an open mind. Difference of opinions is what makes life interesting, and but just the ability to have open-ended discussions where you can talk about these great films in actual and have actual discourses is the way it should have always been. And unfortunately, any serious talk about the Bond films quickly devolves into just the usual generalities about preferred actors and eras and preferred films, and not actual hardcore analysis of what makes these films tick and how do they feel different from one another, and their historical context of production, which is really the key of each individual film, and why I started doing these tracks in the first place. So once again, thank you so very much for listening, and the Motion Picture Analyst will return in my commentary for The Living Daylights. So as always, very humbly yours, I am the Motion Picture Analyst.